Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. Indeed. It was the year 2019, and I was working as a software engineer at an IT company in Chennai, India. Life was good. I enjoyed my work, had great colleagues, and the pay was decent. One day, news spread through the office that Abhishek, one of our senior developers, had gotten engaged to Priya, a programmer on another team. We were all excited for them, especially since office romances were rare. Abhishek was originally from a small village in rural West Bengal, and he wanted to have a traditional Bengali wedding ceremony back in his hometown. Being the friendly guy he was, Abhishek invited our entire 50-person office to attend. Unfortunately, most people had to decline due to the travel distance and time off required. In the end, it was just going to be me and Rajesh, one of the engineering managers, who would represent our company at the festivities. Rajesh booked our train tickets and hotels. Since neither of us had ever been to West Bengal before, we decided to arrive 5 days before the actual wedding to get our bearings and do some sightseeing if time permitted. I was excited for a little adventure and to experience a new part of India. After a long 30-hour train journey, we finally reached Abhishek's village. It was small and rural, but seemed to have all the basic amenities. Abhishek's family home was surprisingly large, and they had plenty of spare rooms for guests. We got settled into our accommodations and rested from the trip. Over the next couple days, Abhishek was busy with wedding preparations and didn't have much time to spend with us. Rajesh and I explored the village a bit, but there honestly wasn't a whole lot to see or do. By the third evening, boredom was starting to set in. That's when Rajesh came up with an idea. "Hey Vikram, I heard there's a cave near here that's supposedly haunted. Want to go check it out?" I was a bit surprised. I never took Rajesh as someone interested in paranormal stuff, but I was up for anything to liven up our trip. "Sure, why not? Could be fun," I replied. "How far is this cave?" Rajesh pulled up a map on his phone. "Looks like it's about a 30-minute drive from here. There's a lake next to it, too. We could leave after 4 p.m. and be back well before dinner." It sounded like a plan. We went to inform Abhishek's father, the village headman, about our little excursion. To our surprise, he gave us a stern warning. "It's fine to visit, but make sure you are back in the village before 10 p.m. Don't stay out there late," he said somberly. We assured him we would be back by then. I was intrigued. Was there really something dangerous about this cave and lake? I figured the headman was just being overly cautious with his guests. If only I knew then how wrong I was. If only I had heeded the old man's warning more seriously. What awaited us at that cave would turn out to be far more horrifying than I could have ever imagined. At 4 p.m. sharp, Rajesh and I hopped into one of the village jeeps that was used for transporting goods. The vehicle had seen better days, but it ran well enough for our short trip. Abhishek's teenage cousin, Tamal, had offered to drive us to the cave, which was a relief since neither Rajesh nor I knew the roads around here. It was monsoon season in West Bengal, so the landscape was lush and green. As the jeep bounced along the pothole-ridden dirt roads, dense forests whizzed by on either side. All my worries faded away, replaced by a childish excitement of exploring a new place. After about 30 minutes, Tamal turned off the main road into a narrower dirt path. We entered a heavily wooded area, leaves rustling in the wind. There was no sign of the cave yet. "We're almost there," Tamal said. "Just have to go a little further down this way." A few minutes later, he pulled over and parked the jeep. "It's a short walk from here," he explained. We stepped outside, stretching our legs. Even through the thick canopy of trees, I could make out the rain clouds gathering above. The humid air felt heavy. As my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, I took in our surroundings. We were completely surrounded by jungle, The jeep trail was the only sign of human presence. Tamal retrieved a flashlight from the back and motioned for us to follow him. As we walked along an overgrown path cutting through the underbrush, a strange sensation prickled the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched, which was ridiculous since we were in the middle of nowhere. I shrugged it off and continued walking. After a 10-minute hike, the trees opened into a clearing, and an awe-inspiring sight greeted us. A massive cave entrance yawned open in the limestone cliff face, rising dozens of feet high. Next to it was a serene lake, its still surface reflecting the cloudy sky. The air hung with an eerie silence. "Here we are," announced Tamal, "the Kapalkundala cave and lake." Rajesh and I approached the cave entrance, peering into the inky blackness that seemed to swallow all light. I heard the flutter of bat wings echoing from the depths. A pungent, dank odor wafted out, the smell of wet earth and something else I couldn't put my finger on. A shiver ran down my spine. The cave certainly looked the part of a haunted location. According to legend, the ghost of Kapalkundala roams this area, Tamal said ominously. On full moon nights, people say they hear wailing coming from the cave and see a figure walking on the lake. Who is Kapalkundala? I asked, trying but failing to keep my voice steady. A woman who lived over 100 years ago. The stories say she was married off to an abusive older man. One full moon night, she fled from him into the jungle and drowned herself in this lake. Her anguished spirit has wandered here ever since, crying out for the life she could have had. I gulped. I wasn't usually superstitious, but something about this place did feel off. Rajesh, on the other hand, looked unperturbed. He clapped me on the back jovially. "Ooh, what a creepy tale. Let's take a closer look, shall we?" Before I could protest, Rajesh strode forward into the cave mouth, flashlight cutting a beam through the darkness. With great reluctance, I followed behind him, casting one last glance at the safety of daylight outside. Tamal remained in the clearing, saying he would wait for us. The cave tunnel twisted and turned, the air growing colder and danker as we went deeper underground. I stayed close behind Rajesh, not wanting to get lost in a side tunnel. Our footsteps crunched on the gravelly floor, echoing off the dripping limestone walls. It felt like we were descending into the bowels of the earth itself. I couldn't shake the uncanny sensation of an unseen presence watching us. As we rounded another bend, Rajesh stopped short, and I nearly crashed into him. I looked up to see his flashlight beam fixed on the cave wall, specifically on a series of ancient paintings etched into the limestone. Human figures danced and hunted across the rock face, rendered in ochre pigment. But what really caught my attention were the deeper gouges in the stone, claw marks that raked across the images as if something had tried to deface them. Something with very large, very sharp claws. A deep, primal fear seized my heart like a vice grip, and it took all my self-control not to bolt out of that cave. Every hair on my body stood ramrod straight. I tugged at Rajesh's sleeve. "Let's get out of here," I croaked. "I've seen enough." Rajesh hesitated, clearly intrigued by the cave paintings, but seeing the barely contained panic on my face, he nodded. We made our way back through the winding tunnel in silence, the darkness at our backs feeling more oppressive than ever. It took every ounce of will to not glance behind me every other step, certain something was following us. I practically ran the last stretch towards the cave entrance. Blinking in the sudden brightness, I took deep gulps of fresh air, trying to calm my thundering pulse. Now that we were out of the cave, my fear felt a bit silly. There was nothing supernatural about some old cave paintings. Rajesh stepped out, looking pensive. "You know, I read somewhere that claw marks like that are common in caves where early humans lived. They were probably made by cave bears." I stared at him in disbelief. "Cave bears?" Was he serious? No animal claws made marks like that, at least none from the natural world. But I bit my tongue, not wanting to dwell on it further. I just wanted to get as far away as possible from this place. We started making our way back towards the lake, where Tamal waited. And that's when I heard it, a blood-curdling scream coming from the direction of the lake. My heart seized in terror. Rajesh and I exchanged a look of pure fear and took off running. What in God's name was going on? We burst into the clearing and stared in slack-jawed horror at the sight that greeted us. The lake was no longer calm and mirror-smooth. The surface now frothed and churned violently like a boiling cauldron. And in the center of that maelstrom was Tamal, flailing and screaming as he was dragged inexorably into the depths by an unseen force. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Before we could even react, before we could take a single step, Tamal's head disappeared under the angry waves with one last desperate cry for help. Then just like that, the lake fell still and silent once more, as if nothing had ever disturbed its tranquility. As if a teenage boy hadn't just been sucked to his watery grave right before our eyes. Rajesh and I stood there paralyzed, trying to process the sheer enormity of what we had just witnessed. This couldn't be happening. How could a placid lake turn into a whirlpool and take a person's life, all in a matter of seconds? My mind simply refused to accept it. Rajesh broke out of his stupor first. He grabbed my arm and shook me. "We have to go for help now!" His words jolted me back to reality. Help, yes. We had to tell someone. We turned and sprinted back through the jungle towards where the jeep was parked, hearts pounding with exertion and residual shock. But when we reached the dirt path, we found only empty space where the vehicle should have been. It was gone with no sign of it anywhere. An icy dread flooded my veins. This was impossible. Tamal had the only key. Without him, no one could have driven it away. And yet, the impossible had already happened right before our eyes. The sun was starting to set, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. I checked my phone with shaking hands, hoping to call someone from the village. No signal, of course. Could this situation get any worse? We were now stranded in the middle of jungle, miles away from the village, with no transportation and no way to contact anyone. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. Rajesh gripped my shoulders, trying to steady me. "Vikram, stay with me. We'll walk back to the village. It's only an hour or so on foot. We just have to follow the road." I took deep breaths and willed myself to think rationally. Rajesh was right. We couldn't afford to fall apart now. We had to get back and tell everyone what happened, as unbelievable as it was. And so we started the long trek back, sticking close to the only road slicing through the forest. Something was very wrong with that lake. I couldn't shake the memory of the malevolent force that pulled Tamal under, the sheer, unnatural violence of it. As if the waters were hungry. And if there was one thing I was sure of, it was that his death was no accident. No drowning, the lake had taken him. With every step I prayed that the road would not lead us astray, that it would take us out of these eerie woods and whatever dark entities lurked here. But with night falling swiftly around us, I had a terrible feeling our ordeal was only just beginning. Under different circumstances, a walk through the jungle at dusk might have been wonderfully atmospheric. The last rays of sunlight dappling through the canopy, birdsong echoing through the trees, the scent of damp earth rising around us. But after what we had witnessed, those woods took on a sinister quality. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch, and every shadow seemed to conceal some unspeakable menace. The road stretched ahead endlessly, darkening with each passing minute. Rajesh walked slightly ahead of me, his pace determined. I tried to keep up, but my legs felt leaden. How were we going to explain this? The police would never believe us. Hell, I hardly believed it myself. An unnatural force in the lake that swallowed Tamal whole. It sounded like the ravings of a madman. A deep fear gripped me that we would never make it out of this place alive. My thoughts kept circling back to the ancient paintings we had seen in the cave, those figures and claw marks. What if they weren't as old as we thought? What if whatever created them still roamed this jungle? I shuddered with terror. Far off in the distance, I heard the rumble of thunder, promising the arrival of a monsoon storm. Great, just what we needed. I quickened my pace to catch up with Rajesh, and that's when I heard it. The sound of a motorcycle approaching from behind us. Hope flooded through me. Someone was coming! Maybe a villager from the road crew or a forest ranger. We were saved. But as the motor grew louder, something about it sent a chill down my spine. It didn't sound like any motorcycle I had ever heard before. There was a strange, guttural chugging to the engine, like some infernal machine. Rajesh stopped walking and turned to look back down the road. I came up alongside him and gasped. Speeding towards us was an ancient motorcycle sputtering black smoke. Its frame was rusted and dented, the headlamp flickering weakly. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the figure driving it, a headless rider, with tendrils of black mist pouring from the stump of its neck. As it raced closer, I saw with horror that through the tears in its rotted clothing there was only emptiness. No flesh, no bones, just a void. I froze in mindless terror, my brain refusing to process the sheer impossibility in front of us. This had to be some kind of hallucination or waking nightmare. But one look at Rajesh's ashen face told me he saw the same thing. The headless rider was almost upon us now, veering wildly across the road. But at the last possible second it swerved sharply and shot off into the trees. The guttural roar of its engine faded into the night. Rajesh and I stood there frozen, barely breathing. What in God's name had we just seen? Some kind of ghost, a demon? At this point I was terrifyingly willing to believe anything. I tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. Without a word, Rajesh grabbed my arm and began marching down the road at a furious pace, almost breaking into a run. I stumbled after him, my mind reeling. The small, logical part of my brain tried to rationalize that we were just seeing things, that it was a trick of the light mixed with our heightened fear after Tamal's horrifying death. But deep down, I knew better. Something dark and unnatural stalked these woods, and it was aware of us. The next hour was a blur of near-mindless terror as we jogged down the road, trying to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that nightmarish apparition. The storm finally broke, sheets of rain pelting down from the black sky and turning the dirt road into a muddy river. The downpour soaked me to the bone, but I barely felt it, so consumed I was by the need to flee. Just when my lungs were about to burst from exhaustion, Rajesh let out a shout. There, in the distance, a light. As we drew closer, I could make out the dim outlines of a ramshackle hut just off the side of the road, with a kerosene lamp flickering in one window. Smoke curled from its chimney. To my desperate eyes, it looked like salvation itself. Rajesh was already pounding on the wooden door, heedless of the rain. "Hello, is anyone there?" "Please, we need help!" For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. Then the door creaked open, and a wizened old face peered out at us from the darkness within. An elderly woman, her hair white and her face heavily lined. She looked us up and down warily. "What are you boys doing out in this storm? And at this hour?" Her voice was hoarse with age. Rajesh and I started babbling at the same time. "Our friend, he's dead," I blurted out. "He got pulled under the water at Kapalkundala Lake. And our jeep is missing. Please, we need to use your phone to call the police." The old woman's eyes widened at the mention of the lake. She quickly ushered us inside, bolting the door firmly behind her. In the dim kerosene light, I could see that the hut was small and sparse, with only a few pieces of rough-hewn furniture. Bundles of drying herbs hung from the rafters, filling the space with a pungent aroma. She sat us down at the rickety table and wrapped thick shawls around our shivering shoulders. Bustling around the hearth, she brewed a pot of strong black tea and poured it into chipped clay mugs. The hot liquid was wonderfully soothing, and I felt my racing heart slowly begin to calm. The old woman settled into the chair across from us, her dark eyes glittering in the lantern light. "Now tell me everything that happened, from the beginning." Haltingly at first, then with greater urgency, the story poured out of us, arriving at the cave, seeing those eerie paintings, Tamal's horrific drowning, the disappearance of the jeep, and finally, our terrifying encounter with the headless cyclist on the road. By the end of it, Rajesh and I were both trembling, the events of the last few hours crashing down on us. Throughout our tale, the old woman remained silent, listening intently. When we finished, she sighed deeply and leaned back in her chair. "You boys were fools to go near that accursed place. You know about the lake?" I asked desperately. "What is happening here? What did we see on the road?" She was silent for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Then she spoke, her voice low and heavy with sorrow. The Kapalkundala Lake is an ancient place full of old and hungry things. The cave holds dark secrets that should never be disturbed. Your friend is not the first to fall victim to the spirits that dwell there, and I fear he will not be the last. A chill went through me at her words. Spirits. So we truly had witnessed something supernatural. But that meant Tamal's really gone, isn't he? I whispered hoarsely. He's never coming back. The old woman reached out and clasped our hands in her weathered palms. I'm so sorry, boys. Kapalkundala never relinquishes her dead. And now that the two of you have seen her secrets, I fear you are in grave danger as well. What do you mean? Rajesh croaked out. From what? That thing on the motorcycle. She nodded grimly. That was the Headless Rider, one of Kapalkundala's most feared enforcers. An avenging spirit that pursues those marked by the curse of the lake. You are not safe here. It will come for you. Raw fear shot through me at her pronouncement. This couldn't be happening. It had to be some kind of awful nightmare that I would soon wake up from. But the hardness in the old woman's eyes told a different story. What do we do? I asked numbly. How do we escape this? She was quiet for a long moment. There may be a way. An ancient ritual that can lift Kapalkundala's curse, but it will be highly dangerous. Tell me, how far are you willing to go to save your own lives? I met Rajesh's terrorized gaze, seeing my own desperation mirrored there. We were in an impossible situation, trapped in a waking nightmare. But what choice did we have? The alternative was waiting here like lambs to the slaughter, for the Headless Rider to snuff us out. I took a deep breath and turned back to the old woman. We'll do whatever it takes. Her eyes held a strange mix of sorrow and steely determination. She gave a short, sharp nod. Very well. Then listen closely, for there is much you must do and very little time. Outside, the storm raged on, rain lashing against the thatched roof of the hut. But I barely noticed it. My entire being focused on the old woman's words as she outlined our one slender chance for survival. And though I had long dismissed my grandmother's stories of ancient curses and vengeful spirits as mere superstition, here I was, hanging on to every word as if my life depended on it. Because now impossibly it did. To lift the curse, you must return to Kapalkundala Lake during the witching hour, the darkest part of the night, when the barriers between the living and spirit worlds are at their thinnest. There you must each cast an offering into the water and recite the words of the unbinding ritual. Only then will you be free. Offering? Rajesh questioned. What kind of offering? The old woman gave him a sharp look. A precious possession imbued with meaning and memory. Something of great personal value that you would feel pain to lose. The spirits of Kapalkundala demand nothing less. I suppressed a shudder. The idea of willingly going back to that cursed lake after what we'd seen filled me with a suffocating dread. But I knew we had no other choice. If we didn't do this, we were doomed. How will we get back there? Our jeep is missing, I pointed out. To my surprise, a small, humorless smile tugged at the woman's weathered lips. Missing, or perhaps spirited away by forces beyond human control. Worry not, your vehicle is closer than you think. Check the road once the storm breaks. Part of me wanted to ask how she could possibly know that, but at this point, I'd believe anything. Rajesh glanced at his watch, then out at the rain pelting the windows. It was just past 10 p.m. The witching hour begins at 3 a.m., the woman said, following his gaze. You have until then to retrieve your offerings and reach the lake. Not a minute more, or the chance will be lost. She rose stiffly from the table and began rummaging through the many drawers and clay jars that lined the hut's walls, muttering to herself. After several long minutes, she returned holding two objects, a small vial of dark liquid and a strangely inscribed metal disc strung on a leather cord. This is lamp-black ink, mixed with the ashes of sacred herbs, she explained, pressing the vial into my hand. Before you begin the ritual, you must paint the seal of unbinding on your foreheads. It will afford you some measure of protection from Kapalkundala's wrath." She draped the cord over Rajesh's head, letting the heavy metal disc rest against his chest. "And this is a spirit talisman. Keep it close. It may grant you clarity when all other lights go out." I couldn't imagine what sort of clarity would help in a situation like this, but I bit my tongue. Beggars couldn't be choosers. Rajesh fingered the disc uncertainly. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "The ritual, the offerings, why are you helping us?" The old woman's face grew distant, her eyes unfocused as if seeing into another place and time. "I know because I failed to save the one I loved most from Kapalkundala's hunger. My son, my dear Rakesh," she trailed off, and in the heavy silence I suddenly understood the crushing depth of her grief and pain. She had lost her child to the same darkness we now faced. Rajesh bowed his head. "We're so sorry." "I can't imagine." She held up a silencing hand, her eyes refocusing on us with new intensity. "I could not do for my boy what I am doing for you now. If the two of you survive this night, perhaps it will bring his spirit some measure of peace. That is all I can hope for." The weight of her words settled over us like a shroud. We had to survive this. We had to make it count. For Tamal, for Rakesh, for ourselves. The old woman glanced at the window, where the rain was finally starting to lessen. "It's time. You must go now, and quickly. Heed my words. 3 a.m. at the Kapalkundala lake after you've retrieved your offerings. Speak the ritual words exactly as I taught you. And once it's done, leave that place and never return. The spirits do not forgive or forget." I clutched the vial of lamp-black ink tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Beside me, Rajesh gripped the spirit talisman with white knuckles. Fear coiled in my gut, cold and heavy, but beneath it a tiny spark of desperate hope flickered. We had a chance. A small and dangerous chance, but a chance nonetheless. "Thank you," I said to the old woman, my voice rough with gratitude and terror. "I don't know why the fates brought us to your door tonight, but thank you." She inclined her head wordlessly, and in her dark eyes I saw a terrible understanding. The knowledge that we were about to walk into an unimaginable nightmare. But there was steel there too, and a fierce determination. We would not face Kapalkundala alone tonight. I took a deep breath and met Rajesh's gaze. In it I saw my own resolve crystallize. We would face this together, as brothers in the darkness, and we would triumph or fall as one. The old woman unbolted the door, and together we stepped out into the fading storm. The night air was crisp and cool, the scent of wet earth and electricity heavy on the breeze. In the distance, the contours of the tree line loomed black and foreboding. Somewhere beyond that shadowed veil, Kapalkundala Lake awaited, along with the hungry dead. "Remember," the old woman said solemnly. 3 a.m., not a minute more." I nodded mutely, my throat too tight for speech. And with that, Rajesh and I turned towards the waiting road, towards our fate and the ghostly terrors that stood in our way. Back in the city, the world I knew, the biggest challenge had been debugging a tricky line of code or fielding an irate client call. But now I walked into a realm of mist and monsters, curses and restless spirits, where death itself reached out with grasping hands. No more man against machine, but man against the primal, the uncanny, the night side of reality. I shoved down the mind-bending panic, the insistent inner screaming that this couldn't be real, because it was real, horribly, viscerally real. Tamal floating face down in churning black water. As the road swallowed us up, I clung to two fragile hopes, the vial of lamp-black ink in my pocket, and the man who walked beside me. They were all I had. Kapalkundala Lake, an invocation to the hungry dark. We go to meet our demons. Rajesh and I made our way back to the road, hearts pounding. To our shock, the jeep was parked right there, as if it had never vanished. With growing dread, we drove back towards Kapalkundala Lake. We each chose our offering. For me, a cherished photo of my late father. For Rajesh, his grandfather's gold ring. As the witching hour approached, we reluctantly returned to the lakeshore. In the eerie pre-dawn stillness, we painted the seal of unbinding on our foreheads with the lamp-black ink and began the ritual, voices trembling as we recited the ancient words. A wind rose, whipping the lake into a frenzy. Ghostly wails pierced the night. At the ritual's peak, we cast our offerings into the churning water. For a terrifying moment, the maelstrom intensified, and shadowy figures seemed to rise from the depths, their eyes blazing with immortal hunger. We were certain we would be dragged down to join them, but then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos ceased. The wind died away, and the lake turned placid once more, as if a great force had been appeased. An inexplicable sense of lightness filled my chest. The curse was broken. We were free. Shell-shocked and shaken, Rajesh and I eventually made our way back to the village. We informed Abhishek's family of Tamal's tragic drowning, though we kept the supernatural elements to ourselves, knowing they would never be believed. The police launched an investigation, but quickly ruled it a freak accident. The wedding went ahead as planned, though the joy was muted by grief. I caught the old woman's eyes during the ceremony, and she gave me a subtle nod of acknowledgement. A secret shared. Rajesh and I returned to our lives in the city, forever changed by our brush with the uncanny. We swore to never speak of the horrors we had witnessed, though they haunted our dreams. But we also knew that we survived for a reason, that our offerings had satisfied the spirits of Kapalkundala long enough for us to escape, and that somewhere beyond the veil of death, Tamal and Rakesh were finally at peace. The experience forged a bond between Rajesh and I that could never be broken. More than friends, more than brothers, survivors, though we would never forget the terror of that night. We also knew that we could face anything the universe threw at us, together, because we stared into the abyss of Kapalkundala Lake, into the ageless hunger of the dark, and emerged alive, marked by shadows but unbroken, and that is a strength we carry in our hearts forever. The isolation never bothered me before that summer. Living on the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania, our property sat perched atop a steep hill that seemed to guard against unwanted visitors. The winding driveway curved upward through dense trees for nearly a quarter-mile before opening into a clearing where our house stood, proud and solitary against the landscape. I'd lived there for 15 years with my father, who at 93 still maintained his sharp mind and steady hands. The property sprawled across several acres, a testament to the previous generation's desire for privacy. To the rear, an expansive field stretched toward a small mountain that loomed in the distance like a sleeping giant. Dense woods pressed in on the remaining 3 sides, creating a natural barrier between us and the rest of the world. The garage stood as a separate structure, roughly 30 feet from the main house. It was a sturdy building, though its age showed in the weathered wood and rusted hinges. I never gave it much thought before that July. Now I can't look at it without remembering. Our nearest neighbors lived far enough away that their houses remained hidden behind the thick tree line. During the day, this seclusion felt peaceful. At night, especially after what happened, it became something else entirely. The sun was setting on July 12th, 2021, when everything changed. I remember the date, precisely because it marked the beginning of what would become the most terrifying 2 weeks of my life. The sky had taken on that peculiar orange hue that comes just before dusk, casting long shadows across the property as I drove home from work. I pulled up along the yard, the gravel crunching beneath my tires. The engine's purr died away, leaving me in what should have been evening quiet. Instead, the sound that greeted me turned my blood to ice. The banging started suddenly, violent, deliberate impacts against the back of the garage. Each strike resonated with such force that I could feel the vibrations in my chest. It sounded like someone was methodically attacking the structure with something heavy, each impact more aggressive than the last. I stood rooted beside my car, keys dangling uselessly from my trembling fingers. The rational part of my brain tried to process what I was hearing, to make sense of it. But there was something wrong about the rhythm, something too precise and mechanical to be human. For 30 seconds, maybe a minute, I listened, unable to move. Then, as abruptly as it began, the noise ceased. The silence that followed felt unnatural, pressing against my eardrums like cotton wool. "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and weak in the growing darkness. No response came, not even an echo. I sprinted to the house, taking the porch steps 2 at a time. My father was in his usual spot in the living room, reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked on a crossword puzzle. He looked up at my entrance, immediately alert to my distress. "Someone's out there," I managed to say. "By the garage." To his credit, my father didn't hesitate. He set aside his puzzle and grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight we kept by the door. Together we ventured back outside, my heart hammering against my ribs with each step. The beam of light cut through the gathering darkness as we approached the garage. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints in the soft earth, no signs of impact on the walls. We circled the entire structure twice, finding nothing to explain the violent cacophony I'd heard minutes before. As we completed our second circuit, music drifted through the air. The same Pearl Jam song that had been playing in my car during the drive home. But my car was off, the windows rolled up, and there were no other vehicles nearby. The music lasted only a few seconds before fading away, replaced by an absence of sound so complete it made my skin crawl. No crickets chirped. No owls called. Even the usual rustling of leaves in the evening breeze had ceased, as if nature itself was holding its breath. My father suggested we head inside, his calm demeanor betrayed only by the slight tremor in his hand as he lowered the flashlight. I didn't argue, but as we walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line, something that had announced its presence with those methodical strikes against the garage. That night, I lay awake in bed, straining to hear any unusual sounds. None came. But sleep remained elusive as my mind replayed the events of the evening. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe some animal had gotten trapped behind the garage, or perhaps it was just the old structure settling in an unusual way. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever had caused those sounds wasn't natural, and somehow I understood that this was only the beginning. 3 days passed without incident. Just long enough for me to start doubting my memory of that evening, to almost convince myself I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. The evening of July 15th found me on the front porch, seeking solace in my usual after-dinner routine. The sun still hung above the horizon, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold. A fresh cup of coffee steamed beside me, and I had just lit a cigarette, letting the familiar ritual calm my nerves. The sound began as a distant rumble, barely noticeable at first. It grew quickly, transforming into the unmistakable thunder of hooves against earth. Dozens of them moving in perfect synchronization, growing louder with each passing second. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I jerked upward, knocking over both my coffee and the small table it sat on. My cigarette pack went flying, scattering its contents across the porch. The lighter clattered against the railing before disappearing into the bushes below. The stampede sound intensified, becoming deafening. It seemed to approach from all directions at once, as if 100 horses were charging toward the house from every angle. The porch boards vibrated beneath my feet, and I could have sworn I felt hot breath on the back of my neck. I scrambled backward, falling hard against the screen door. My hands fumbled for the handle as the thundering hooves reached a crescendo. Just as I managed to wrench the door open and stumble inside, everything stopped. The sudden silence was so absolute, it made my ears ring. I pressed my face against the screen, heart racing, eyes darting across the yard. The evening light revealed a perfectly undisturbed landscape. No churned earth, no dust clouds, no signs of the massive herd that had seemingly surrounded me moments before. My coffee cup lay on its side, dark liquid seeping between the porch boards. My cigarettes were scattered where they had fallen. Everything else was exactly as it should be, except for the lingering vibration in my bones from a sound that couldn't possibly have been real. I spent the next hour gathering my scattered belongings and cleaning up the spilled coffee, all while trying to rationalize what had happened. The nearest cattle farm was over a mile away, and their fences were secure. I checked them myself the next morning, unable to shake the need to find some explanation. But there was no explanation, at least not one that fit within the boundaries of what I understood to be possible. And as I would soon learn, the boundaries of possibility were about to be pushed even further. The next few days passed in a blur of heightened awareness and frayed nerves. Every unexpected sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threats. I began timing my outdoor activities to coincide with the brightest hours of the day, though I knew that whatever was happening didn't seem constrained by the normal rules of light and darkness. On July 19th, as evening approached, I forced myself to maintain my routine. I refused to become a prisoner in my own home, despite the growing dread that had taken up residence in my chest. The air was thick with humidity, promising a summer storm later in the night. The humming started so quietly, I almost missed it. A low, steady tone that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere at once. It reminded me of the sound high-voltage power lines make, but we were miles from the nearest transmission tower. As the sound grew in volume and intensity, I noticed something strange about the air above the field behind our house. It appeared to ripple like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but in a distinctly geometric pattern. The humming increased, taking on an almost mechanical quality, and the distortion in the air began to move. What I saw next defied all logic. A massive, triangular shape emerged from the distortion, but it wasn't solid in any conventional sense. It was as if someone had cut a triangle-shaped hole in reality itself, revealing something that existed between the layers of what we consider real. The object, if it could be called that, drifted toward the house with deliberate slowness. As it passed overhead, I could see through it to the darkening sky beyond, but its edges were clearly defined, like looking through perfectly clear glass that had been cut into an impossible shape. It moved through the branches of the old trees behind the garage without disturbing a single leaf. The humming reached a pitch that made my teeth ache. And then, as the triangle passed beyond my line of sight, both the sound and the object faded away as if they had never existed. I stood motionless for several minutes afterward, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. This wasn't something I could explain away as a trick of light or an overactive imagination. Whatever I had seen was real, even if it violated everything I understood about reality. That night, I searched online for similar sightings in the area, but found nothing that matched what I had experienced. The closest accounts described conventional UFO sightings, lights in the sky or metallic craft at a distance. Nothing about semi-visible triangles that passed through solid matter as if it wasn't there. I began to wonder if these events were connected somehow. The banging at the garage, the phantom stampede, and now this. Each incident seemed designed to challenge my understanding of what was possible, each one pushing me further from the comfort of rational explanation. The following night brought a new manifestation of the impossible. I was driving home late, around 11 p.m., taking the back roads that wound past the cattle farm that bordered our property. The night was clear, stars visible in patches between the trees that lined the road. Movement in my peripheral vision drew my attention to the left. At first, I thought I was seeing warning lights from some kind of construction equipment. But as I slowed the car, the true nature of what I was witnessing became clear. Hovering 2 to 3 feet above a vast field of grass was an intricate grid of red light. It looked like something from a science fiction movie, perfectly straight lines intersecting at right angles, forming squares of identical size that stretched across the entire field. The light had a laser-like quality, too precise and too steady to be anything made by human technology. I pulled the car over and cut the engine, half expecting the grid to disappear like everything else had. But it remained, casting an eerie red glow over the surrounding area. The lights didn't illuminate the ground beneath them, nor did they seem to have any source. They simply existed, suspended in the air, like a giant net dropped from above. I stepped out of the car, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone to take a picture. But just as I raised the camera, the grid flickered once and vanished, leaving me in darkness broken only by my headlights and the stars above. 2 days later, my daughter reported seeing the same phenomenon in exactly the same location. She described it exactly as I had seen it, down to the height above the ground and the precise geometric pattern. Her sighting occurred at the same time of night, suggesting some kind of schedule or pattern to these appearances. The events of that summer left me changed in ways I'm still trying to understand. But it was what happened 18 months later that truly shattered my conception of reality. Over the winter of 2022, I had begun feeding 2 foxes that frequented our property. One was a traditional red fox I called Foxy, with rust-colored fur and a white-tipped tail. The other, which I named Meow, had unusual coloring, a patchwork of tan and brown that made them instantly recognizable. They became regular visitors, approaching closer each time until they would wait patiently for their meals of dog food, treats, and leftover scraps. I grew attached to them, finding comfort in their predictable appearances after the inexplicable events of the previous summer. On a crisp February morning, I stood watching Foxy eat from the bowl I had set out. The sun was barely above the horizon, and frost still clung to the grass. What happened next plays in my memory like a scene from a nightmare, yet I know I was fully awake and alert. A column of brilliant white light descended from the clear morning sky, enveloping Foxy in its glow. She rose onto her hind legs, a position I had never seen her take voluntarily. Her body began to sway, moving in an unnatural pattern, as if controlled by unseen forces. I could see her clearly within the light, her fur standing on end, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. She appeared frozen in that pose, unable to break free from whatever force held her. Then a second beam appeared, this one a deep purple color, piercing through the center of the white light. What happened next defies explanation. Foxy's form began to rise from the ground, still locked in that bizarre pose. She ascended perhaps 10 feet into the air and then simply ceased to exist. One moment she was there, caught in that terrible light, and the next she had vanished completely. I searched the sky frantically, looking for any sign of aircraft or other technology that could explain what I had witnessed. There was nothing. No unusual sounds, no disturbances in the air, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary had occurred except for the half-eaten bowl of food on the ground. Foxy never returned. Neo continued to visit for several more weeks before disappearing as well, though I never witnessed anything unusual during their appearances. The loss of Foxy haunted me more than any of the previous incidents, perhaps because it involved a creature I had grown to care about, or perhaps because it was the most overtly aggressive action I had witnessed. As I look back on these events, certain patterns emerge that make me question everything I thought I knew about reality. Each incident seemed designed to challenge a different aspect of what we consider normal and possible. The garage incident demonstrated that sound could exist without a source, that physical effects could occur without visible causes. The phantom stampede proved that our senses could be overwhelmed by something that left no trace of its passage. The triangle in the sky showed that solid matter might not be as solid as we believe, and that things could exist in states between visibility and invisibility. The red grid suggested a level of technological precision far beyond our current capabilities, while the disappearance of Foxy proved that whatever forces were at work could interact with and affect living creatures in ways that defied physical laws. Each event occurred when I was alone, or with just one other witness. Yet the consistency between multiple observers, like my daughter's sighting of the red grid, suggests these weren't mere hallucinations. The incidents seemed to escalate in their intensity and implications, leading up to the final act of taking Foxy. 2 years have passed since Foxy's disappearance, and I still don't have answers. The events of that summer and its aftermath have left me with a profound understanding that the world is far stranger than we imagine. The neat categories we use to organize reality, possible and impossible, natural and supernatural, seem hopelessly inadequate in the face of what I experienced. I still live in the same house, still walk the same property. The garage stands as it always has, showing no signs of the violence it once endured. The field where the triangle passed remains unchanged, and the spot where Foxy vanished looks like any other patch of grass. But I am changed. I find myself watching the sky more carefully, listening more intently to the sounds of the night. I've installed security cameras around the property, though some part of me knows they would probably fail to capture anything unusual. Whatever forces were at work seemed to exist just beyond the reach of conventional documentation. I've considered moving away, but where would I go? If these events were tied to this location, would leaving protect me from future incidents? And if they weren't tied to the land, if they were somehow connected to me personally, wouldn't they simply follow? So I stay, maintaining my routines while remaining vigilant. I still feed the local wildlife, though I try not to become too attached. I've learned to live with the knowledge that reality is far more fluid and mysterious than most people realize, that the boundaries between the possible and impossible are not fixed, but permeable. The bitter chill of that February night in 1991 still haunts me to this day. I was only 11 years old, a child caught in the turmoil of my parents' recent divorce. My father, a soldier stationed at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, had always nurtured my love for the outdoors, camping, hiking, fishing, horseback riding. But when my mother took custody and moved my older sister and me to the dusty town of Price, Utah, to live with our grandmother, my world turned upside down. Anger and hurt consumed me as I struggled to adjust to this strange new desert landscape, so different from the lush mountains of Colorado. No one seemed to care about my feelings, my longing for the life I had known. In my young mind, I fixated on one escape, to go camping again, to feel that connection to nature that had always brought me solace. I threw tantrums, I pleaded, I begged. Finally, in late February, a glimmer of hope appeared. My mother had been dating a man for a couple months who offered to take us camping in the San Rafael Desert of southern Utah. He seemed to understand my restlessness, my need for this trip. My excitement grew as we packed up the car that Friday, ready for a weekend adventure. But fate had other plans. Just as we were about to leave, my mother got called into work unexpectedly that Saturday. Low on the seniority ladder, she had no choice but to go in or risk losing her job altogether. So early that Saturday morning, she and my older sister, who was using the drive to practice with her learner's permit, headed back to town, and I was left alone with the boyfriend in the vast expanse of the desert. At first, the day unfolded like a dream. The boyfriend took me hiking up a mesa to a hidden cave where ancient Native American paintings still adorned the walls. He taught me to search for arrowheads and flint, sharing stories of the Navajo and Paiute tribes who once called this unforgiving landscape home. I soaked up every word, marveling at this window into the past. But as quickly as a cloud blots out the sun, his mood shifted. A darkness settled over him, a simmering anger I had never seen before. He turned on me, his words cutting deep into my young soul. I was a brat, he snarled, an ungrateful child undeserving of his time and knowledge. My mother would be better off without me, he said. Everyone would be happier if I just disappeared into the desert, never to be seen again. Tears stung my eyes as he continued his verbal onslaught. He claimed my mother felt the same way. that she had only agreed to this camping trip to abandon me out here. She hated camping after all. I knew that much was true. In my young mind, his cruel taunts started to make a twisted kind of sense. I was a burden, unwanted and unloved. And then came the most terrifying moment of all. He told me to start running because if I ran, he wouldn't have to hurt me. I watched in horror as he began to load what looked like a .38 caliber pistol, paralyzed by fear. At 11 years old, I didn't know much about guns. All I knew was that I had to get away, so I ran. I ran with all the strength my small body could muster, tears streaming down my face, not daring to look back. I ran until the camp disappeared from view, until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I ran for my life, unsure of where I was going or what would happen to me out here in this unforgiving wilderness. When I finally stopped running, disoriented and exhausted, the camp was nowhere in sight. I had no idea how far I had gone or in what direction. Fear gripped me as I realized the gravity of my situation. I was lost and alone in the desert, with no food, water, or warm clothing. In my haste to escape, I hadn't thought to grab anything. I found a small cave to huddle in, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing thoughts. But I knew I couldn't stay there for long. He would come looking for me eventually, I was sure of it. And when he found me, I shuddered to think of what he might do. In that moment, I felt utterly hopeless. The boyfriend's words echoed in my mind, that my mother didn't want me, that I should just disappear. Maybe he was right, I thought. Maybe this was all my fault for being such a difficult child, for insisting on this stupid camping trip in the first place. Sobs racked my body as I curled in on myself, the rough stone of the cave digging into my back. But as I sat there, consumed by despair, a memory surfaced. My father's voice, patient and wise, teaching me what to do if I ever got lost in the mountains. "Find a river if you can," he had said, "and follow it downstream. It'll most likely lead you to civilization eventually." A spark of determination ignited within me. I couldn't just give up, not without trying to find help. I remembered passing a river on the drive in the day before. If I could just locate it again, maybe I would have a chance. With renewed purpose, I crawled out of the cave and set off in search of the river, my senses on high alert for any sign of the boyfriend or other dangers lurking in the desert. The sun beat down mercilessly overhead as I walked, my mouth growing drier with each passing minute. But I pushed on, driven by a primal instinct to survive. Time lost all meaning as I wandered through the barren landscape, my thoughts consumed by regret and self-blame. Why had I been such a brat, so insistent on this trip? My selfish desires had landed me in this nightmare. Now I was going to die out here, and it would be all my fault. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, and with it, the temperature began to plummet. My thin t-shirt offered little protection against the biting chill that seeped into my bones. Shivers racked my body as I stumbled onward, my tears leaving icy trails down my wind-chapped cheeks. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I tripped over a rock and tumbled into the shallow waters of a small river. The shock of the cold water jolted me out of my miserable daze. Spluttering and coughing, I dragged myself onto the bank, my clothes now soaked and clinging to my skin. Panic seized me as the reality of my situation crashed down once again. Night was falling fast, and I was wet and freezing in the middle of nowhere. I needed shelter, and I needed it now. Frantic, I scanned my surroundings until I spotted a small alcove in the rock face nearby. It wasn't much bigger than a coat closet, but it would have to do. I crawled inside, hugging my knees to my chest in a desperate attempt to conserve body heat. As darkness enveloped the desert, strange noises began to echo through the night. Howls and yips that sounded like coyotes, but somehow different, deeper, more guttural. I had heard coyotes before, but these sounds sent icy tendrils of fear down my spine. Peering out from my meager shelter, I gasped at the sight before me. In the pale moonlight, I could make out several large, dog-like creatures circling the area. But they weren't like any coyotes I had ever seen. They were massive, their silhouettes almost human-like as they moved on two legs. Terror consumed me as I watched these unnatural beings stalk through the night, their eerie cries piercing the air. I prayed they wouldn't find me, that they would just go away and leave me be. But some primal instinct told me these creatures were aware of my presence, toying with me like a cat playing with a mouse. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to be a bad dream. But the chill in my bones and the pounding of my heart reminded me this was all too real. I was at the mercy of the desert now, with only my wits and a flimsy rock alcove to protect me from the horrors that lurked outside. I must have passed out from sheer exhaustion and fear, because the next thing I knew, I was blinking awake to the first tentative light of dawn. The creatures were gone, the landscape still and silent once more. But as I tried to stand, a new kind of agony made itself known. My legs were numb and heavy, almost like they belonged to someone else. Each step sent shooting pains through my feet, even through the unnerving lack of sensation. I was hungry, thirsty, and utterly miserable. All I wanted was my mom, to tell her how sorry I was for causing all this trouble. Tears streamed down my face as I berated myself out loud, my voice small and pitiful in the vast expanse of the desert. And then I saw it. A large, wolf-like creature standing atop a nearby ridge, its gaze fixed intently on me. My heart leaped into my throat as it let out a sharp yip, then darted away out of sight. I stood there, frozen in confusion and fear. What did it want? Was it going to attack me? Eat me? I had no idea what to do. But then, just as suddenly, the creature reappeared at the bottom of the ridge, maybe a football field's distance away. It yipped again, louder this time, before turning and walking slowly in the opposite direction. Every few steps, it would pause and look back at me, as if checking to see if I was following. Each time, it would let out another insistent yip, its meaning becoming clearer with each repetition. Against all logic, I found myself considering the impossible. Did this creature want me to follow it? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. But what other choice did I have? I was lost, alone, and on the brink of giving up entirely. So, with a deep breath and a silent prayer, I began to trudge after the enigmatic beast, my feet screaming with every step. If this was to be my end, then so be it. At least I wouldn't die without trying. I followed the creature for what felt like hours, my world narrowing to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its heat beating down on my already battered body. Just when I thought I couldn't go on any longer, the creature came to a sudden halt. It turned to face me, its eyes boring into mine with an intensity that stole my breath. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, human and beast, locked in a silent communication I couldn't begin to understand. And then, without warning, the stillness was shattered by the roar of an engine. The creature bolted, disappearing into the brush as a truck came into view. I blinked in disbelief, hardly daring to hope. But as the vehicle drew closer, I saw the unmistakable markings of a state park ranger. Tears of relief sprung to my eyes as I tried to jump up and down, waving my arms to catch the ranger's attention. But my weakened legs gave out, sending me tumbling to the ground in a heap. The truck screeched to a halt, and the ranger leaped out, rushing to my side. He scooped me up like I weighed nothing at all, placing me gently in the passenger seat as he radioed in that I'd been found. Within moments, he pressed a Snickers bar and a can of Coke into my hands, urging me to eat and drink. I devoured them greedily, the sweetness exploding on my tongue like the nectar of the gods. As we sped back towards civilization, the ranger explained that I was suffering from severe hypothermia and frostbite. The numbness in my feet, he said, was a sign of serious nerve damage. I barely registered his words, too overwhelmed by the sheer relief of being found, of being safe. I was going home. I was going to see my mom again. But even as I let the exhaustion take over, my mind drifted back to the mysterious creature that had led me to salvation. The ranger said I must have been hallucinating, that the hypothermia had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. Those creatures, whatever they were, had been real, and they had saved my life. The aftermath of my ordeal was a blur of hospital visits and hushed conversations. The doctors wanted to amputate some of my toes. The frostbite was so severe. But my mother refused, insisting they do everything they could to save them. I learned the awful truth about the boyfriend's intentions. He had wanted my mother all to himself, and I had been an obstacle in his path. When she rejected his twisted plan, he had fled, leaving me for dead in the desert. The police searched for him, but he was never found. A part of me hoped he was lost out there, suffering the same fate he had intended for me. But mostly, I just wanted to forget, to move on from the nightmare that still haunted my dreams. Years passed, and I tried my best to put the trauma behind me. But the scars remained, both physical and emotional. I struggled with the cold, my damaged nerves screaming in agony whenever the temperature dropped too low. And the feeling of being lost, of not knowing where I was, could send me spiraling into panic at a moment's notice. It wasn't until I was 15 that I finally found some measure of peace. My best friend, a Navajo girl, asked me to share my story with her great-grandmother. The wise woman listened intently, her weathered face etched with understanding. When I finished, she told me of a legend passed down through generations, of a family of skinwalkers who roamed the San Rafael swell. But these were not the evil, malicious creatures of most tales. No, these skinwalkers were different. They sought only to be left in peace, to protect their desert home from those who would do it harm. The great-grandmother's words settled over me like a warm blanket, a balm to my fractured soul. Perhaps the creatures I had seen that night were not figments of my imagination after all. Perhaps they were guardians, watching over the lost and the helpless in their domain. I may never know for certain what really happened out there in the desert. But one truth remains crystal clear. The real monster in my story was not the supernatural, but the very human evil that had left a young girl to die. And to those mysterious beings, whether skinwalker or hallucination, I owe my life. They were the ones who led me to safety, who guided me back from the brink of despair. In a world where the line between man and monster is so often blurred, I can only be grateful for the protectors that walk among us, unseen and unsung. To this day, the events of that fateful camping trip linger in the shadows of my mind. The trauma, the fear, the sheer helplessness, they are not wounds that heal easily, if at all. I have tried to move forward, to build a life not defined by the horrors of my past. But the echoes remain, surfacing in the most unexpected moments. The feel of a chill down my spine, the sound of a coyote's howl in the night. These are the triggers that send me hurtling back to that desperate, lonely place. The panic rises like a tidal wave, threatening to pull me under. But I fight it every single day. I cling to the memory of those strange, otherworldly creatures, to the knowledge that even in our darkest hours, we are not alone. I may never understand the true nature of what I experienced that night. Were they truly skinwalkers, as my friend's great-grandmother believed? Or were they something else entirely, some ancient power beyond our comprehension? In the end, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they were there when I needed them most, a lifeline in a sea of despair. And so I carry on, one day at a time, learning to find strength in the very scars that once threatened to break me. I'm a survivor, not just of the desert, but of the darkness that dwells within the human heart. To the boyfriend, the monster who set this all in motion, I have only one thing to say: your cruelty did not define me. Your hatred did not destroy me. I'm still here, still standing, and I always will be. And to the creatures of the San Rafael swell, the silent guardians who watch over the lost and the forsaken, thank you. Thank you for saving a little girl's life, for showing her that even in the darkest of nights, there is still hope to be found. I may never walk through that desert again, but I carry a piece of it with me always, a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected grace that can be found in the most unlikely of places. My story is one of survival, of the thin line between man and monster, and the power of the human will to endure. It is a testament to the mysteries that still linger in the wild places of the world, and the guardians that watch over us when we are at our most vulnerable. And it is a promise to myself and to all those who have faced the darkness and lived to tell the tale. We are stronger than we know, and we are never truly alone. Growing up in the remote wilderness of Alaska, I learned from a young age that fear was a constant companion. Our small, scattered homestead community along the Squintna River attracted hardy folks, off-grid survivalists, seasonal lodge operators, and summer vacationers seeking an escape. But even for the toughest among us, the untamed landscape held an undercurrent of unease. My family's modest cabin sat perched on a rise overlooking a vast marsh that stretched out to the horizon. As a child, I would often find myself transfixed by the hypnotic sway of the tall grass in the breeze, the light dancing off the dark water. But as the midnight sun dipped low, painting the world in an eerie blue-gray half-light, my wonder would turn to dread. Peering out into the gloaming, I sometimes thought I glimpsed shadowy figures moving along the far tree line. Just moose, my parents would assure me, chuckling at my overactive imagination. Nothing to fear out there but the odd ornery bear. I wanted to believe them. After all, hadn't Dad put down that problem grizzly himself, the behemoth lying in a crumpled heap not 30 feet from our porch? And yet, in the pit of my stomach, a cold unease still twisted. It came from a place deeper than childish fears of sharp teeth and claws, an unspeakable wrongness I could not name. As I grew older, the wariness never fully left me, but neither did a burning desire to prove myself, to show that I could hack it in the untamed wilds of the last frontier. So at 16, armed with a sturdy axe, bear spray, and a .22, I began venturing out to explore our remote corner of the Alaskan bush on my own. I would set out for hours, tromping through the dense woods that bordered the marsh, skirting the edges of the dark water. I relished the solitude, the sense of possibility, but I never quite shook the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention, of hushed, heavy breaths mingling with the whisper of leaves, of a gaze on my back, cold and appraising. It was on one of these rambling solo excursions that I first spotted it. A towering, hunched figure silhouetted against the grey sky at the end of the trail. I only caught a fleeting glimpse as I sped past on my four-wheeler, but in that split second, my blood turned to ice. Its form appeared hazy, almost spectral, impossibly tall and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs ending in wicked claws. A bulbous head swiveled toward me, snouted face splitting into a jackal grin. Then between one blink and the next, the apparition vanished. I slammed on the brakes, adrenaline screaming through my veins as I whipped around for a second look. But the trail stood empty, no sign of the nightmare creature. A moose, I told myself, my knuckles white on the handlebars. Just a big, ugly, emaciated moose. Nothing else could possibly stand on two legs like that. And yet, the twist of unease in my gut told a different story. The fears of my childhood came rushing back as I sped home, that awful face seared into my mind's eye. I resolved to stay far away from that lonely stretch of trail, to bury what I had seen in the deepest recesses of memory. But the thing in the woods had other plans. Over the next year, subtle but unnerving changes crept over our remote homestead. Game became scarce, even for our skilled subsistence hunters. Moose carcasses turned up with unsettling frequency, the bodies broken and ravaged in ways that made even the most grizzled among us shudder. Dad would stride grimly into the house after a long day, lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "Found another one," he'd mutter, shrugging off his pack with a heavy sigh. "Just outside the east pasture this time." Yearling calf looked like a horse. Damn thing had its head clean off. Mom would make the sign of the cross, murmuring a prayer under her breath. We all knew the protocol by now. The dogs were kept in at night, scraps burned promptly. No trace could remain to draw scavengers, or worse, to our doorstep. The killings inched closer, bolder, A headless bull moose splayed obscenely in front of the tool shed, cloudy eyes fixed on the house in an accusatory stare. Massive paw prints gouged into the foundation. The earth churned as if by a piece of heavy machinery. Whispered stories filtered in from across the marsh. Of a neighbor returning home to find his huskies cowering beneath the crawl space. A massive, foul-smelling creature trying to force its way inside. Of a leg found dangling gruesomely from the high branches of a spruce, the femur snapped clean in two. I kept my own chilling encounters to myself, but the dread grew with each passing day. Those fleeting glimpses of spindly limbs and hooded eyes in the tree line. Guttural howls that shook the windows and reverberated in my chest. The distinct feeling of being hunted, stalked by an intelligence far beyond that of any normal beast. It all came to a head on a late summer evening, the light just beginning to fade to that unsettling blue-grey. I lay on my bed with a book, trying to ignore the oppressive sense of foreboding that seemed to permeate every inch of the house. That's when I heard it. Heavy footfalls thudded across the lawn, clumsy and lumbering. Then an ear-splitting crack as something slammed into the side of the house with incredible force. A fist? A tree branch? I sat bolt upright, heart jackhammering painfully against my ribs. The thing outside panted and snuffled, heaving breaths stertorous and thick with phlegm. A cloying carrion reek wafted through the window screen, the bouquet of an open grave. I gagged, bile searing my throat, and scrabbled for my phone with numb fingers. With a shaking hand, I flipped off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into murky dusk. Some primal instinct warned me not to peek, to stay statue still and pray the hulking shape didn't smash straight through the wall. But morbid curiosity pulled my gaze inexorably to the window. At first, I saw nothing. Just the blank face of the house, pale siding marred by a long, splintered gash. Then from directly beneath the eaves, a bulbous head slowly rose into view. My heart seized, realization crashing over me in an icy wave. It had been hugging the wall, lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to investigating the noise and step blindly into its reach. Malevolent yellow eyes, glazed with cataracts, met mine through the dusty pane. Thin lips peeled back from a maw bristling with jagged teeth. I must have made some choked sound, some unconscious noise of horror. The thing jerked its head toward me, nostrils flaring. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other, predator and prey. Then with a phlegmy snort, it loped off into the gathering dark. Shell-shocked, I could only sit frozen on my bed, a high, keening sound building in my chest. This was no moose, no bear, not even some bizarrely deformed wolf. The thing that crouched outside my window, so horrifically twisted yet undeniably sapient, belonged to a category all its own. With trembling hands, I replayed the muffled recording I had managed to capture. The rattling breaths, the wet, meaty sounds of its movements. Beneath the ringing of blood in my ears, a sickening realization dawned. It had wanted me to see it, to know it was there, biding its time. I didn't sleep that night, jumping at every groan of the house settling, every hoot of an owl. When watery light finally crept across the lawn, I wasted no time. I had to know, had to see for myself. On leaden legs, I stumbled out to the wall where the creature had stood. The damage was even worse in the harsh light of day. Rough gouges marred the siding, where a thick branch had been slammed repeatedly into the wood. Tufts of wiry fur and oily smears of some dark substance clung to the splinters. The ground beneath the window was a morass of churned mud and trampled grass, and there, half buried in the muck, lay a femur. The massive leg bone gleamed a sickly yellow-white, its ends splintered as if gnawed. I recognized it instantly. A match for a grisly trophy that had turned up overhanging a neighbor's shed just days before. Now I knew beyond all doubt. The unholy thing stalking our woods was not just a mindless predator. It was leaving us a message, carrying out a vicious pattern, toying with us for its own inscrutable purpose. I wanted to run screaming into the house, to bury my head beneath the blankets and beg my parents to move us back to civilization. But a grim, steely resolve hardened in my bones. This was our home, our land. And by God, I wouldn't let some nightmare beast drive us out. With renewed purpose, I gathered my gear and set off into the woods toward the trail where I'd first glimpsed the creature. If it was hunting me, then I'd just have to become the hunter. Following that familiar yet unnerving path I'd sped down so many times, I eventually reached the spot seared into my brain. The stump pile loomed before me, rotting logs spilling halfway down the steep embankment to the marsh's edge. Creeping closer, the wrongness in the air became palpable. Several dark holes yawned between the debris, tunneling into the hillside. Dens, big enough for a large animal to squeeze through. The ground around them was littered with tufts of coarse hair, shards of bone, and drifts of desiccated carrion flies. My heart began to race, hands slick on my rifle grip. Every instinct screamed to turn tail and run. But I had to know. Holding my breath, I leaned forward to peer into the inky mouth of the nearest opening. The smell hit me first. A rank miasma of decay and musk, heavy enough to coat the back of my throat. Pressing my sleeve over my nose, I forced down the urge to retch and squinted into the gloom. At first, I could make out nothing but vague shapes. Then my eyes adjusted to a scene that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The den opened into a chamber, its floor carpeted with splintered remains. Bones of every size and description protruded from the muck: moose, caribou, wolf, bear, and in the center a massive nest woven from branches, its bowl lined with matted fur. In it lay 3 lumpen forms, their chests rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Not quite canine, not quite ursine. Their twisted bodies sprouted patches of wiry hair, knobby spines jutting grotesquely beneath leprous skin. Revulsion and terror warred within me, freezing me in place. They were abominations, blasphemies against nature, and if the adult was the horror that came to my window, I could scarcely comprehend the level of malicious cunning necessary to carry out its vile deeds. Just as I gathered the courage to slink away, a huffing grunt sounded close at hand. I staggered back from the den mouth, pulse thundering in my ears. Not 10 yards away, the creature emerged from the tree line, dragging a mangled half-carcass in its jaws. Our eyes locked, and in that instant I knew the depth of my mistake. Lips rippling back from jagged fangs, the thing dropped its grisly burden and let loose a roar that shook the earth. Birds erupted from the treetops, fleeing the promise of bloodshed to come. Life crystallized to a single imperative: escape. I turned on my heel and plunged into the marsh, icy water filling my boots as I churned through the muck. The creature's furious bellows shattered the air at my back. The hunt was on. Tall grass whipped my face as I tore through the marsh, lungs searing with each desperate gulp of air. Behind me, the creature gave chase, its guttural snarls seeming to come from all sides at once. How could something so massive move with such horrifying speed and agility? My mind raced as fast as my feet, throwing out silent pleas to any deity that might listen. Let me reach the tree line. Let my feet find purchase in this sucking mire. Let my rifle stay dry, stay ready. Because if I went down now, if that thing caught me in the open, splashing footfalls and heaving breaths dogged my every step, always closer than they should be. The marsh seemed to stretch into eternity, an endless sea of sawgrass and stagnant water conspiring to slow my flight. Reeds clutched at my ankles like grasping fingers, their serrated edges drawing thin lines of blood. Just as my muscles began to flag and my vision tunneled, I burst from the marsh onto solid ground. The tree line loomed ahead, its shadowed depths promising blessed relief from snapping jaws. With a final surge of adrenaline, I sprinted for the forest fringe, grasping for low-hanging branches to pull myself faster. The creature bellowed in rage as I plunged into the undergrowth, putting precious distance between us. But my elation was short-lived. These were its woods, its domain. Even if I managed to shake my pursuer for a moment, I had to assume it could track my scent, anticipate my path. I needed to outsmart it long enough to break for open ground and safety. Forcing down my thundering pulse, I willed myself to think. There was a place, an old prospector's mine not far from here. More of a hole in a hillside than a true tunnel. If I could reach it, squeeze into that narrow shaft, the beast would be too large to follow. It might be my only chance. Veering sharply to the left, I crashed through a screen of devil's club, ignoring the barbs tearing at my skin. The snarls behind me took on a confused, frustrated edge, but didn't falter. I silently thanked my father for the years of drilling navigation into my thick skull as I hurtled over fallen logs and zagged between boulders. The creature would have my scent, but it couldn't outmaneuver me. At last, the maw of the prospector's tunnel came into view, a triangular scar in the lichen-crusted rock. Putting on a final burst of speed, I scrabbled up the scree slope and flung myself into the opening. The shaft was a tight fit, all jagged stone and stifling darkness, but I wedged myself as far back as I could, heart beating a painful tattoo against my ribs. An enraged howl split the air, so close it sent pebbles skittering down the rock face. I shoved my fist against my mouth to stifle a whimper as a massive, malformed paw swiped at the entrance. Once, twice. Claws scraped against stone, a snout puffed fetid air. But the tunnel held. I was safe. For now. Outside, the creature paced, keening its fury for the forest to hear. I hunched against the chill stone and tried to calm my racing thoughts. If I could just wait it out until dark, maybe I could slip away, find my way back to the homestead. But as the hours crawled by and my muscles cramped and chest ached, a horrible truth crept over me. The thing wasn't leaving. It had settled on its haunches at the mouth of the tunnel, those terrible eyes fixed unerringly on my huddled form. Waiting. It knew as well as I did that eventually I would have to come out. And it would be there. Darkness fell, and with it a bone-deep cold seeped into the stone at my back. My muscles burned with fatigue, stomach hollow and throat parched. At the mouth of the tunnel, the creature's bulk was a black silhouette against the star-pricked sky, motionless but for the slow rise and fall of its sides. I shifted minutely, trying to bring some feeling back into my deadened limbs. At even that tiny motion, the thing twitched, a low growl rumbling in its chest. It was toying with me, I realized, a mouse pinned beneath a cat's paw, letting me stew in my fear, wear myself down to a nub. Bile stung the back of my throat, but I couldn't give in to despair. I had to keep my wits, watch for any opening. Sliding my hand slowly, carefully down my side, I brushed the stock of the rifle still slung across my back. A plan began to take shape, born of desperation and perhaps a touch of madness. If I could just maneuver the gun around, get off a clean shot at the thing's bulk. Inch by painstaking inch, I shifted the rifle, trying to avoid any sound that might alert the creature. Sweat trickled down my temple despite the chill, every breath a shallow sip of air. Finally, I had the barrel pointed outward, braced against my shoulder. The thing hadn't moved, but I could feel the weight of its gaze, the coiled readiness in its stance. Exhaling slowly, I centered my aim as best I could in the darkness. Squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was deafening in the confines of the tunnel, the recoil slamming me back against jagged stone. A hideous squealing yelp told me I'd found my mark. I didn't wait. Ignoring the spots dancing across my vision, I surged forward, shouldering past the thrashing creature and out into blessedly open air. The crack of underbrush told me it was already giving chase, but I had wounded it, bought precious seconds. Plunging back into the forest, I set a breakneck pace, lungs screaming and muscles quivering with fatigue. The snarls at my back grew weaker, interspersed with high, keening whines of pain. But I didn't dare slow, not until I burst into the familiar clearing of our homestead. The living room lights beckoning like a lighthouse in a storm. They almost didn't believe me at first. My ashen-faced family clustered around the kitchen table. It sounded too fantastic, too nightmarish to be real. But the blood, both mine and the creature's, spattered across my clothes told a grim story. And the haunted shadow behind my eyes, the tremble in my hands, spoke to horrors that couldn't be denied. We kept watch that night, posted in grim vigil at the windows. But no hulking shape emerged from the tree line. No guttural howls shattered the eerie calm. It seemed my bullet had struck true. Perhaps the thing had crawled off to lick its wounds, or to die. I desperately hoped for the latter. The authorities were called, then Fish and Game. They listened to my story with furrowed brows, exchanged long glances, promised to investigate, send out patrols. But I knew from their tight-lipped expressions, the way they fingered the brims of their hats, that they thought it the ravings of a frightened, impressionable youth. Some hysteria brought on by too many hours alone in the woods. I couldn't blame them, not really. If I hadn't seen the thing with my own eyes, felt its fetid breath on my face, I wouldn't have believed it either. But I knew the truth, knew it in the marrow of my bones. And I knew we couldn't stay, not with the chance of it returning, or others of its kind prowling the marsh. It was a hard decision, striking out for the city, leaving behind the only life we'd ever known. But in the end, preserving our family, our sanity, mattered more than any tract of land. The night before we departed, I took a final walk through the silent woods, breathing in the sharp scent of pine and moss. Part of me would always belong to this wild place, would crackle with its untamed energy, but I had learned, in the most visceral way, that we were not its sole masters. That there were ancient things, dark things, that walked the hidden places of the earth. Things that would not scruple to make us prey in our own domain. As I cast a last glance over the dark waters of the marsh, I shuddered, pulling my coat tighter against a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. Let the wilds keep their secrets, their horrors. I would not be returning to seek them out again. Life moves on, the raw edges of terror smoothed by time and distance. But there are still nights I startle awake in a cold sweat, the echo of guttural howls chasing me up from dreams. Still times I see shadows move in the periphery of my vision, and my pulse quickens, muscles tensing to run. I've learned to live with it, the small, vigilant part of me that will always scan the horizon for hulking shapes. Strain to hear the crack of underbrush beneath heavy tread, a hard-won wisdom, a scar on the psyche that will never fully fade. But it's a small price to pay, I suppose, for the chance to grow old, to watch the seasons turn beyond a pane of glass, secure in the knowledge that the only monsters are the ones we make for ourselves. Still, on certain evenings when the wind moans through the eaves and the light fades to a murky grey, I can't help but wonder, does it still prowl those lonely woods, nursing its wounds, its hate? Do its offspring feed and grow, learning the ways of the hunt? And will some distant part of me, the frightened boy crouched in the darkness, be forever trapped in the periphery of its gaze, waiting for the day when the fading scent of my fear calls it back to finish what it started? I pray I never learn the answer. I have an unconventional job, to say the least. I'm a professional golf ball diver. The title is pretty self-explanatory. I dive into lakes and ponds on golf courses to retrieve lost balls. It's tough, dirty work, but it pays surprisingly well. I have contracts with various courses that allow me to collect the balls, which they clean, repackage, and resell. For every ball I recover, I earn a fee, usually 13 to 18 cents a ball, depending on the arrangement. It may not sound like much at first, but when you're hauling in 3,000 to 4,000 balls a day, it adds up fast. The story I'm about to share happened a few years ago, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Like so many others, I found myself struggling financially when the pandemic hit. My work dried up overnight. Though the job pays well, I live pretty modestly, so even a short disruption in income was hard on my bank account. After some time without work, I'm ashamed to admit I turned to night hawking, which is illegal diving on courses after hours. Being well known in my local golf community, I knew better than to trespass on active courses. Getting caught could destroy my career and reputation. Instead, I targeted abandoned courses. Most folks don't realize just how many failed golf courses are out there. Some get sold off and turned into housing developments. Others are simply left to overgrow and fade back into the wilderness, untouched for years, with piles of balls just waiting to be scooped up from the bottom of the ponds. I had been in the business long enough to know where many of these forgotten greens were located. I had even worked on a few before they went under. In the dead of night, under cover of darkness, I'd drive out to one of these abandoned courses, fill a couple of bags with balls, and head home with my illicit bounty. It was almost too easy. After some time of alternating between 3 reliable spots, I decided to tackle a 4th course I'd been avoiding. This one had been abandoned for much longer than the others, and I'd stayed away for good reason. Not only was it completely overgrown after years of neglect, but it bordered a stretch of dense, impenetrable swampland that made it extremely difficult to access. This particular course, Riverbend Links, had been built in the middle of nowhere decades ago. It was originally designed as an ultra-exclusive retreat for wealthy VIP clientele who desired privacy and seclusion. However, after operating for just over a decade, the course went under, shuttered by embezzlement scandals and massive debts. When it closed, the surrounding swamp immediately began aggressively reclaiming the manicured territory that man had stolen from it. That fateful night, as I pulled up to what was left of the crumbling access road leading to the abandoned course, I was greeted by an ominous sight. A row of bright orange, water-filled barricades, clearly placed there by the authorities to prevent exactly what I was about to do. This broken, fractured road was the only way in or out of the old golf course, and the first tee was still a mile ahead. I had anticipated the barricades, though. A few days earlier, I had scouted out the area and knew they were there. I came prepared with a folding gorilla cart that I could use to load and haul all my diving equipment the rest of the way in on foot. Working quickly and quietly, I lifted my cart and gear piece by piece over the barricades before loading everything into the wagon to start the long trek toward the course. As I began pushing the cart down the remnants of the road, I was unnerved by how utterly destroyed the pavement was. It resembled a shattered mirror with ragged fissures zigzagging across the surface. Thick, gnarled weeds and tufts of razor-sharp sawgrass sprouted skyward from the cracks. The road's edges were lined by rows of busted, weathered lampposts, wrapped in tangled, choking vines. Luckily, the night wasn't quite as dark as it usually was this time of month. A bright, nearly full moon hung in the clear sky, bathing everything in an eerie, pale glow. The moonlight, combined with the piercing beam of my headlamp, illuminated the unsettling scene before me. After about a half-hour of struggling with the unwieldy cart down the ruined road, I finally reached the dilapidated remnants of what had once been the parking lot. The former lot stretched out before me like a flat, featureless grey plain. It stood stark and desolate against the towering greens and browns of the wild grasses and choking weeds that were steadily encroaching from all sides, hell-bent on reclaiming the land. Directly across from where I stood catching my breath, on the far side of the cracked asphalt expanse, loomed the old clubhouse. The once elegant wooden structure had been ravaged by the elements and the passage of time. The boards were blackened by mold, visibly rotted through even at a distance. Most of the clubhouse's windows had long since shattered, leaving darkened holes resembling the vacant eye sockets of a skull. Portions of the roof had collapsed inward under the weight of overgrowth. Through one cavernous opening, I could see the silhouette of a skeletal tree stretching upwards, its jagged, bare branches seeming to claw desperately at the star-flecked night sky above. Many years ago, back before everything went to ruin, I had briefly worked at this course as an assistant greenskeeper during a summer in college. While my memory of the exact layout had grown hazy with time, some distinctive parts remained clear, like the location of the especially large, deep pond positioned in the rough alongside the fifth-hole fairway. That pond was my ultimate destination on this risky nighttime mission. Back when the course was still maintained to PGA standards, it would have been about a 25-minute stroll from the clubhouse to that fifth-hole pond. But now, with the relentless swamp steadily reclaiming the once pristine fairways and artfully sculpted hazards, I knew the arduous trek would likely take me at least twice as long. Especially burdened with hauling my inevitably heavy dive cart, I paused at the threshold of the parking lot and gazed warily toward the far left side, where the impenetrable wall of dense, overgrown foliage loomed like a fortress. The mere thought of the harrowing slog ahead made me shudder involuntarily. Exhaling loudly through my nose, I put my shoulder to the cart, parted the curtain of towering weeds, and soldiered onward, slowly disappearing into the untamed green abyss, unsure of what I might encounter within. Navigating through the untamed chaos to locate the fifth hole proved even more difficult and disorienting than I had anticipated. The overgrowth of sawgrass, dandelions, and some other unidentifiable species was nearly as tall as me in places. It forced me to stop frequently to cautiously peek over the vegetation, desperately trying to regain my bearings. The relentless vegetation seemed to purposely impede my progress, almost as if the swamp itself was actively trying to repel my intrusion. After fighting the unyielding thicket for what felt like an eternity, but in reality was probably about 40 minutes, I finally stumbled across a weathered, splintered wooden sign barely jutting out from the omnipresent greenery. I wiped away a clump of slimy algae obscuring the faded words. The sign originally read Hole 5, but at some point since the course's closure, an anonymous vandal had crudely spray-painted "Butt" over the hole, so that it now simply read Butt 5. Despite the unnerving setting and my exhaustion, I couldn't help but smirk at the juvenile graffiti. It was an unexpected moment of levity in an otherwise dreary slog. But my amusement was short-lived, quickly evaporating as I surveyed the scene. Before me, now standing at the edge of the pond I had sought. The moon had shifted during my trek, now hanging directly overhead like a baleful eye. Its cool light danced across the surface of the pond, transforming the black water into an undulating sea of molten silver. I gazed out at the oddly serene, glittering spectacle of nature reclaiming this unnatural impoundment. Tearing my eyes away from the mesmerizing ripples, I carefully laid out my gear on a relatively dry patch of ground. After a few minutes of rummaging in my cart, I was fully suited up. Clenching my dive knife between my teeth, I waded out into the cool, inky water with purpose. At first, the silt-laden banks muted any sound, my legs swishing through the water in rhythmic silence. But as I moved out deeper into the pond, an explosion of frightened wildlife suddenly erupted around me. Countless startled bullfrogs wailed and thrashed, fleeing my intrusion by leaping erratically across the pond's mirrored surface. A pair of majestic blue herons burst forth from the cattails, their massive wings beating the air as they took panicked flight. The ruckus was jarring in the otherwise deathly still night. I continued forward until the water lapped at the bottom of my chin. Then, after taking one last deep breath of the damp, swampy air, I dipped below the surface, vanishing into the unknowable black depths, unsure of what awaited me below. As I sank down through the water column, I was immediately engulfed by an oppressive Stygian darkness. I switched on my headlamp, but the normally powerful beam barely penetrated the turbid, silt-choked water. Even with the light, my visibility was reduced to mere inches in front of my face. I wasn't surprised or daunted by the impenetrable inky murk, though. You see, the vast majority of golf course ponds and water hazards are composed of something known as black water. It's not polluted or toxic. It simply contains extremely high concentrations of organic material, like decomposing leaves and grass, that steep in the water like tea, dyeing it a deep, opaque brown. Even during the day, a black water pond has virtually zero underwater visibility. It's like trying to open your eyes in an unlit closet. In this line of work, retrieving golf balls is an entirely tactile endeavor from start to finish. I carefully felt my way down, gingerly touching the tips of my neoprene gloves to the squishy bottom. Then, like a blind man reading Braille, I began methodically sweeping my hands back and forth across the muddy substrate, probing for the telltale dimpled surfaces of my lost spherical quarry. Despite the challenging conditions and unfamiliar pond, it didn't take me long to ascertain that this particular spot was going to be the proverbial jackpot. With nearly every pass, my groping fingers discovered multiple golf balls half buried in the silty muck. The sheer volume was staggering, but it made sense. This pond had likely sat undisturbed for years, patiently collecting its submerged treasure since the course's abrupt closure. Progress was relatively slow going, because in addition to the sought-after golf balls, the bottom was littered with all manner of debris. Jagged sticks, sharp rocks, clumps of fishing line, shards of broken glass. My hands explored all of it, unseeing in the dark. But the copiousness of the balls littering the bottom made enduring the occasional cuts and scrapes more than worthwhile. Before I knew it, I had completely filled the mesh satchel slung over my right shoulder to its maximum capacity. The haul had to weigh at least 30 pounds. I awkwardly kicked toward the surface, my muscles already aching from the strain. I burst out of the still water, hauling myself up onto the muddy shore, panting from the exertion. Without allowing myself a moment to rest, I quickly swapped out the full satchel for an empty one. No time for breaks. I needed to maximize my harvesting time in this untouched pond before daybreak. With the fresh bag draped across my body, I slogged back out into the water, heading toward the middle of the pond this time, before diving down for a second round. As I plunged back down into the pond's concealing embrace, I was struck by how preternaturally still and quiet the water was once the initial flurry of disturbed wildlife had subsided. It was almost like being suspended in the infinite blackness of outer space. The only sounds were the ones I created myself, the rhythmic sloshing of my arms parting the water, the steady suction of my regulator, and the occasional clattering of salvaged balls inside my satchel. I continued sweeping the bottom, moving, with a bit more haste now, letting greed motivate me more than methodical caution. About halfway to the center of the pond, my probing fingers unexpectedly struck something large and distinctly metallic instead of the usual debris. Curious, I ran my hands along the cold, curved surface, quickly discovering a set of all-terrain tires and a dented bumper. I had stumbled upon a sunken golf cart. Momentarily shocked, I floated motionless as I tried to wrap my head around the discovery. How in the world had a golf cart ended up this far out in the middle of a water hazard? The absurd image of a drunk golfer recklessly driving straight into the pond flashed through my mind, making me chuckle into my regulator. The escaping bubbles tickled my face as they rushed upward. Still amused by my accidental underwater archaeology, I resumed searching the bottom around the sunken cart, but my preoccupied mind was no longer registering the occasional sharp rocks or pointy sticks jabbing into my fingers. That lack of situational awareness almost proved deadly. Without warning, I suddenly felt a massive, fast-moving disturbance displace the water mere inches from my body. Whatever it was had rapidly approached from behind me and passed by far too close for comfort. Jolted back to high alert, I froze in place, trying to discern what had just brazenly invaded my personal space. I had been diving in golf course ponds long enough to immediately rule out the usual suspects like bass, carp, or even gar. No, this was something else entirely, something immense, something powerful. The unsettling realization hit me like an anvil. The enormous shape cruising through the water could only be one creature, a mature American alligator. My blood instantly turned to ice in my veins as primordial panic wrested control of my mind. I knew my initial instinct to panic wasn't going to help me, though. I had to fall back on my training and experience to survive this encounter. Taking a deep, calming breath, I ran through the gator safety lessons I'd learned by heart, fighting the urge to hyperventilate. I systematically reviewed everything I knew about dealing with alligators underwater. First and foremost, gators almost never attack divers in their habitat, unless they feel cornered or directly threatened. So as long as I remained calm and didn't make any sudden movements, I shouldn't be in immediate danger at the moment. At least, that's what I kept repeating to myself as I tried to slow my hammering pulse. However, I also knew all too well that the true danger with diving in gator-inhabited water always came at the end, when it was time to surface. That's when the deadly reptiles are most likely to strike without warning, often mistaking divers for prey as they break the surface. I had heard plenty of grisly stories from fellow golf ball divers over the years that fueled my nightmares. Attacks were rare, but they did happen. The other behavior I knew to be extremely wary of was a gator that appeared overly curious or kept approaching too close. That was a telltale sign that a normally timid gator might be feeling bold or aggressive for some reason. Maybe it was defending a nearby nest or had been fed by humans before. And fearless gator was an attack just waiting to happen. So before I even contemplated ending my dive, I needed to surreptitiously assess this animal's behavior and position myself close to shore for a hasty exit. Moving with deliberate slowness, I rotated in place, trying to visually penetrate the veil of suspended silt that had been kicked up by the gator's passage. But the fallout from the milky cloud rendered my headlamp all but useless, diffusing its light into a dull, shapeless glow that illuminated nothing. Unwilling to blindly grope for golf balls any longer, I grudgingly decided it was time to call it a night gator or no gator. I'd already amassed an impressive haul anyway. Slowly finning myself upright, I prepared to make my way back to my entry point, ready to bolt at the slightest hint of trouble. That plan immediately disintegrated, though, because the massive reptile chose that precise moment to make an uncomfortably close pass by, apparently circling back to investigate me after our initial startling encounter. I warily tracked the gator's route by feel as it glided through the water, its armored flank nearly brushing against my trembling legs. Once I was reasonably sure the far too curious gator had moved a relatively safe distance away, I cautiously began moving toward where I thought the shoreline was. But in my unnerved state, I had gotten myself turned around. I wasn't entirely sure which direction would lead me out of the pond the quickest anymore. Trusting my gut, I started swimming toward my best guess, moving as quickly as I dared. Meter by agonizing meter, I tried to smoothly accelerate, not wanting any sudden, splashy movements to pique the lurking gator's interest again. But I could sense the cunning predator was still out there, watching me from the concealing depths. I swore I could feel its unblinking reptilian eyes, tracking my every movement. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. After what seemed like an eternity of protracted dread, the texture of the pond's bottom slowly began rising up to meet me. I was getting close to a shoreline. With a sudden surge of desperate hope, I kicked a little harder, propelling myself upward. At last, my head broke the surface of the still black water. I tensed, expecting an explosion of violence as the gator seized its moment to strike. But the expected attack didn't come. I blinked the water out of my eyes, my spinning head lagging a few seconds behind as it tried to reorient to being above the surface. Treading water, I quickly scanned my surroundings. The bad news was, in my frazzled state, I had veered way off course. While I had thankfully managed to reach a shoreline, it wasn't anywhere near my original entry point where I'd left my gear. The good news was, the bank was close, maybe 20 feet away, a distance I could cover in seconds with a burst of adrenaline. Not wanting to push my luck a single second longer than necessary, I immediately started cutting through the water, paddling with renewed vigor, high on the promise of dry land and safety. I was already fantasizing about stripping out of my heavy, waterlogged gear and taking a well-earned breather. And beneath that, my mind was positively buzzing as it calculated the night's impressive haul. Between this pond's long-forgotten bounty and the inevitable treasures awaiting me in the other water hazards, I'd be able to fill my garage with premium balls. I'd have enough inventory to last months. I was already excitedly planning my next expedition in my head when the gator finally made its move. Out of nowhere, in a heart-stopping explosion of water and violence, the gator struck. 1 second I was swimming, and the next second my lower body was engulfed in the gator's crushing grip as it began dragging me backward and down. The attack was so sudden and startling that my brain couldn't even fully process what was happening at first. My flailing legs were wrenched beneath the surface in a single, powerful motion, like a rag doll in the jaws of a dog. I barely had time to suck in a desperate lungful of air before my head was whipped below the water too. The bull gator began to spin its massive body, trying to subdue and disorient me as it brought its full mass and strength to bear. I had always morbidly wondered how I might react if this exact scenario ever happened. If I would rise to the occasion and fight for my life, or freeze up and accept my grisly fate. But now that the horrific moment was actually here, playing out in real time, I was shocked to discover my brain had entered a weird state of hyper-focused detachment and clarity. Time itself seemed to slow down and fracture. I remember vividly marveling at the raw, unearthly power of the primordial beast that had me in its clutches. It felt like I was being pulled by a submarine. My every frantic kick and twist and contortion accomplished absolutely nothing against the gator's implacable strength. If anything, my struggles only spurred it to bite down harder and thrash more violently. Acting on pure survival instinct, I groped for the dive knife sheathed on my hip. I knew the blade would be all but useless against the armored plates on the gator's back and flanks. My only hope would be to find one of its relatively small, vulnerable spots. The eyes, nostrils, or the fleshy, unprotected skin at the back of the throat. Somehow, I managed to awkwardly draw the knife, barely keeping my grip on the handle as the gator continued to roll us over and over beneath the churning water. I slashed behind me blindly, trying to force the reptile into releasing me, but each desperate swipe failed to find its mark in the disorienting, silty chaos. Then just when I thought I had no fight left in me, the very tip of my probing blade struck something that felt distinctly different than unyielding armor. It was a patch of tissue that actually yielded a bit under the knife's pressure, almost like a dense inner tube. Knowing I had nothing left to lose, I refocused all my remaining strength into a single, targeted thrust. I drove the point of the knife into that pliable flesh with everything I had, leaning into it, trying to penetrate as deeply as possible. The wounded gator's reaction was instantaneous and intense. As soon as the knife plunged into its vulnerable underbelly, the thrashing beast released its crippling grip on me. It rocketed away, its tail catching me with a glancing blow as it retreated in a tempest of bloody turbulence. Suddenly finding myself free, I clawed for the surface, my legs kicking spastically of their own accord. I sucked air into my burning lungs, wheezing and sputtering even as I windmilled toward the muddy embankment. Upon reaching the shallows, my trembling arms gave out. I belly flopped into the muck, content to lay there heaving for a bit before dragging myself up the rest of the bank. Every fiber of my being was utterly spent. I collapsed onto my back, chest heaving, wheezing like an asthmatic as I stared up at the uncaring stars. As my breathing slowly returned to normal, I glanced back over the deceptively placid surface of the pond, half expecting the gator to come lunging out of the water at any second to finish the job. But as I focused through the haze of pain and exhaustion, I saw a disturbance on the far side of the pond. Something huge was emerging from the water over there, its movements strangely labored and jerky. At first I thought the gator was crawling out onto the bank, defeated and dying. But then the lumbering shape began to rise, unfolding upward until it was standing fully upright on two legs. My fading nightmare crashed right back down on top of me. The bipedal thing was at least 8 feet tall, its silhouette all wrong in the pale moonlight. Some sort of thick, ropey tail seemed to be dragging behind it. Water streamed off its hulking body in torrents as it staggered forward a few steps, moving with an alien gait. Then it stopped and slowly pivoted back toward the pond. I watched in uncomprehending horror as the unknown creature's unsettling gaze panned across the pond. And then, to my unraveling sanity, its eyes seemed to lock directly onto my own. Even from a distance, I could feel the weight of its stare, cold and appraising. We stood transfixed for a few eternal seconds, regarding one another across the pond's mirrored stillness. Then I saw it, my knife's handle, protruding from the creature's midsection at a crazy angle. Without making a sound, the thing abruptly turned and began lurching into the swamp, vanishing into the shadows between the moss-draped cypress trees and dangling vines, leaving me stunned and reeling in its wake. To this day, I couldn't tell you exactly what I encountered out there on that abandoned golf course. A part of me never wants to know the full truth, because I honestly believe that the revelation might shatter what's left of my sanity. But there's one thing I'm absolutely certain of now. We humans aren't the only ones reclaiming the spaces we've abandoned. There are things out there on the fringes and in the shadows. Ancient things that were here long before us, just waiting patiently for their turn to take back what we so arrogantly tried to claim as our own. And very occasionally, an unsuspecting person might accidentally stumble into their resurgent domain, unaware they are now trespassing in a liminal space between worlds. That's why people still whisper about certain woods that should be avoided, about particular mountains that are not meant for human feet, about specific lakes where you shouldn't swim after dark if you value your life. They may not fully remember the reasons behind the warnings anymore, but they recognize the echoes of something that should be feared and shunned, because deep down, we know that's where the monsters have always lived. I've always enjoyed winter camping, the kinds of trips that really push you to your limits and force you to embrace the cold and silence of the frozen wilderness. A few years ago, I decided to go on a solo trip deep into north-central Pennsylvania. The area I picked out was so remote that getting there would require an hour-long drive down dirt forest service roads, followed by a 6-mile hike along a barely visible trail. There wasn't a soul around, and I wasn't expecting to see anyone. The quiet, snow-covered forest was exactly what I was looking for. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and barely recognizable as a path. I had to push through dense, wet brush, and there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of anyone having been there recently. It felt like the kind of place that only those looking to truly escape the world would find. The trail followed a creek down a rocky valley, which didn't make for an easy hike. Let me assure you, the terrain was steep and uneven, with ice patches and thick snow covering the rocks, making each step a careful decision. But the beauty of the place, the stillness, the quiet, crisp air, it was well worth the effort. I had no specific destination in mind. I was just wandering through the woods, hoping to find a good spot to set up camp. As the sun began to set and the temperature drastically dropped, I came to a fork in the creek. There was a section of relatively flat land that looked perfect for a campsite, and I carefully crossed the creek, stepping cautiously on the slippery rocks. Then I started to investigate the area. Scattered across the snow were signs that someone had been there recently. A tarp was spread out on the ground next to a stone fire ring, and nearby a log about a foot in diameter had been chopped in half so cleanly that it had to be with some kind of axe or blade. I moved closer, my curiosity piqued, but also a growing sense of unease settling in my gut. Inspecting the area more carefully, a pile of gear immediately stood out. There were food wrappers, a small cooking set, a camping pad, and a first aid kit, everything someone might need for a winter camping trip. All of it was just left behind, carelessly discarded, as if someone had just walked away from it mid-trip with no intention of coming back. I continued exploring, more irritated at this person's carelessness than anything, until I found the clothes. They were piled by the creek, damp from the last rainstorm that had passed through the day before. They weren't wet enough to be fresh, but they hadn't dried out properly either. They sat there, almost as if abandoned, with a towel draped over a nearby branch, still damp and heavy with moisture. It was an eerie sight, these everyday objects just left behind with no owner in sight. A shiver ran through me that had nothing to do with the frigid air. Then, as I walked a bit further, I came across something that truly disturbed me to my core. There was an area near the creek, clearly used as a toilet based on the disgusting mess left behind. Piles of toilet paper, some stained with feces and others with remnants of urine, were scattered across the ground. It wasn't just one or two pieces either. It was a whole mess of them, indicating that someone had been using the spot regularly for maybe 2 to 3 weeks. The stench hung in the air, only partially masked by the crisp scent of snow and pine. But that wasn't what I found so blood-chillingly disturbing, though. Hidden behind a cluster of trees was a strange metal structure, almost like a cage, but not anything I could make sense of at first glance. It was about 4 square feet, constructed from thick metal bars that looked like they'd been welded together to form a crude cube frame. Obviously, I knew it looked enough like a cage to call it one, but the thing that didn't make sense is that it didn't seem to have any kind of opening. No door, no hatch, no way for anything to get in or out once the final bar was welded into place. It looked like someone had purposely built that thing out there in the middle of nowhere, because no one in their right mind would have dragged that heavy monstrosity all the way out here. And it would also explain why they stayed in that one spot for so long based on the waste left behind. But then why build it? And why construct it so that it was completely sealed with no way in or out? I felt a chill go through me, one that had nothing to do with the winter air. Something about the entire setup, everything from the abandoned gear to the weird cage, was enough to majorly give me the creeps. There was one major problem, though. With daylight dwindling, I'd been looking for a spot to camp. Now, with the sun starting to set, I could either turn back and try to hike out in the dark on a trail that I barely knew, or I could stay there, almost right next to the place that was giving me the worst feeling of dread I'd ever experienced. It wasn't an easy choice, but in the end, I decided not to gamble on finding a new spot this late, and I set up camp right there, as far from the cage as I could get while still having access to the flat ground. I didn't feel safe at all. But the alternative of risking injury or getting lost in the dark posed risks that I wasn't prepared to entertain. Yet even though I was somewhat confident the cage builder wasn't going to return, there was a lot of trash, but no tent or sleeping gear. I still felt incredibly on edge. I was constantly looking over my shoulder as I set up my small tent and built a fire, jumping at every noise in the darkening woods. The knife I carried was almost constantly in my hand, ready in case anything went wrong, but I still couldn't feel 100% safe, especially not after the sun went down fully and true darkness descended, broken only by the flickering orange glow of my small fire. Every rustling noise, every snap of a branch in the distance made my heart race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. It felt like someone or something was watching me from the inky shadows just beyond the reach of my firelight. As I sat there, practically vibrating out of my skin with terror, my mind raced with all the horrific possibilities of what that cage could be for. Was it some kind of trap? A sadistic hunter's way of capturing animals to torture? Or perhaps something even more sinister, like a place to hold human captives? Each possibility I imagined was worse than the last, and I cursed myself for not hiking out immediately upon finding it. Darkness be damned. I barely ate, fear and nausea twisting my stomach into knots as I forced down a protein bar and some water. The night dragged on, minutes feeling like hours, as I strained my ears for any noise that could signal approaching danger. I couldn't bring myself to crawl into my tent, feeling far too vulnerable, with just the thin nylon walls between me and whatever was out there. So I stayed by the fire, clutching my knife and barely blinking, determined to face head-on anything that came my way. I barely slept at all that night, just brief snatches of fitful dozing propped up against a tree. I kept hearing things, sounds that had me wide awake and brandishing my knife in seconds. There were footsteps in the distance, the crunch of boots on snow, or at least that's what my petrified mind interpreted the noise as, and the sound of something big moving through the trees, branches cracking and bushes rustling, something far too large to be any kind of prey animal. The noises always seemed to be just beyond the edge of the fire's glow. Too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to send shivers of pure terror down my spine. The fire flickered and crackled, casting long black shadows that danced and writhed around me, shapes that looked almost human before morphing into monstrous forms. The play of light and shadow did little to calm my already shattered nerves, instead amping up the gut-wrenching horror of my predicament. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, pale and thin in the winter air, I was already packing up as quickly as I could with trembling hands. I didn't care that I was still half asleep, that my body ached from tension and lack of rest. I wanted out of that place, away from that ungodly cage, and the creeping certainty that something terrible had happened there was maybe still happening. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the icy fingers of dread were wrapped around my throat as I shoved gear haphazardly into my pack with fumbling fingers. I left that awful valley behind without a second glance, not even bothering to fully extinguish the remains of my fire before practically running back up the trail, following my footprints from the day before. The snow seemed even deeper as I slogged through it on sore, unstable legs. The straps of my pack dug into my shoulders. My lungs burned from gulping in frigid air, but I didn't dare slow down. I had to get away, had to escape the suffocating aura of wrongness and malice that permeated those woods. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could physically manage in my exhausted, terrified state. The entire way, I couldn't shake the horrific images of the abandoned camp, the discarded clothes, the revolting piles of human waste, and most of all, that unnatural cage. It haunted me as I walked, plaguing each step with visions of the unimaginable atrocities that could have taken place in its unforgiving metal confines. Was it a torture chamber? A place to imprison and inflict unfathomable pain on the unwilling? Or perhaps a sick holding cell, where kidnapped victims were kept like animals until their captor saw fit to end their suffering? Each scenario that clawed its way through my mind was more terrible than the last, made all the worse by the pervasive sense of being watched, followed. As I fled those cursed woods, even when I finally made it back to my truck, collapsing into the driver's seat with heaving breaths and knees nearly knocking together from freighted shakes, I couldn't let my guard down. I locked the doors immediately, actually checked the back seat like a child afraid of boogeymen, before I dared to pull out with a spray of gravel and snow. My eyes flicked compulsively to the rearview mirror as I bounced and jolted down the unpaved logging road, wholly expecting to see a figure emerge from the trees, chasing me. That same primal fear from the night before lodged in my throat. It wasn't until I pulled out onto the blessed safety of the paved highway, of the vehicles and signs of humanity finally coming into view, that I was able to suck in a full breath. It felt like a massive weight was lifted from my chest, but my muscles remained locked tight, jumping at every flash of movement in my peripherals. I drove the rest of the way home, in a haze of sweat-inducing anxiety and pulse-pounding adrenaline, unable to fully convince myself that I'd truly gotten away unscathed. When I got home, I immediately called the Forest Service and reported what I had found with a shaking voice and stumbling words. I could barely string together coherent sentences as I tried to convey the skin-crawling wrongness of that far-flung campsite and the malformed cage that seemed ripped from a nightmare. The ranger on the phone listened patiently, jotting down the details and GPS coordinates as I relayed them, before asking me to email any and all pictures I had taken of the scene. With still trembling hands, I plugged my phone into my computer and sent them over. The images of that rusty metal abomination and trash-strewn camp burning themselves into my retinas as I clicked through them. It felt like I was willingly reliving the traumatic experience with each photo, the yawning black maw of terror opening up inside me once more, threatening to swallow me whole. The ranger called me back after about an hour. His calm, almost nonchalant demeanor, a stark contrast to my frayed nerves and residual panic. He told me it was probably just some loner living out there, maybe someone trying to escape society and live off-grid. He reasoned that the cage could be some kind of DIY animal trap, or a storage locker for food that the builder didn't want bears or other scavengers getting into. But his voice wavered slightly when I pressed him about the lack of any doors or openings in the structure, and I could tell he was just as perplexed and unsettled as I was, even if he was trying to downplay it for my benefit. He also mentioned it could possibly be the remains of an old moonshine operation or pot grow site, though he admitted the second option didn't seem likely for that particular area and time of year. I could tell he was just grasping at straws, trying to come up with any semi-logical explanation to diffuse the clinging sense of horrid unease the discovery evoked. But none of his half-baked theories did anything to ease the knots of fearful tension in my gut, the certainty that there was something deeply, disturbingly wrong with not just the cage, but the whole situation. There was a disturbing realness to it that surpassed any scary story or conjured nightmare, a grim weight that told me it wasn't just the product of my overactive imagination. I never went back to that spot, though part of me desperately wanted to at first, if only to prove to myself that it had been real and not some vivid hallucination brought on by isolation and paranoia. I thought maybe if I could see it in the clear light of day, investigate further without the choking fear clouding my mind, I could figure out what that cage was really for and put the relentless, nagging dread to rest. But another part of me, the louder, more sensible part, knew that would be a huge mistake. I had escaped that place unharmed through sheer luck and horribly timed circumstance, and I had no illusions that I'd be so fortunate a second time. Something in my gut, an infallible sixth sense honed by too many close calls and near misses, warned me that going back would only lead me to whatever dark end had befallen the cage's creator, and so I stayed away, even as the nightmares plagued me for weeks, months afterwards, waking screaming and drenched in icy sweat from twisted visions of finding myself trapped inside that horrible box, unable to move or escape, forgotten in those frigid woods. I'd jolt awake gasping, my partner shaking me and asking what was wrong, what I'd dreamed of. But I could never bring myself to describe the sheer, mind-bending terror of it. I tried to move on, to chalk it up to just another bizarre, unexplained oddity I'd encountered over my years of solo hiking and camping in the backcountry. But even as time passed and the nightmares slowly faded, I couldn't shake the deep visceral dread that had sunk its claws into me that night. It followed me like a shadow, an icy prickle at the back of my neck, a constant paranoia that had me double and triple checking locks, jumping at the sound of footsteps behind me, seeing danger and dark intent in every stranger's face. The worst part was that I never found out what happened, never got any closure or answers. The Forest Service sent a ranger out to investigate the site, but by the time they got there, a late winter snowstorm had buried all traces of the campsite and that sinister cage. They searched as best they could, but found no evidence of the horrors I had stumbled upon, no clues as to who had built it or why. It was as if the whole terrifying ordeal had been erased, swept clean by the uncaring hand of nature, leaving me to question if it had even been real at all or just a figment of my overstressed psyche. But I knew, with paralyzing certainty, that it had been all too real. The lingering psychological scars, the residual echoes of mind-numbing fear imprinted on my very soul, were testament enough to that fact. The ranger filed it away as an unsolved oddity, just another strange tale to add to the many that circulate among those who spend their lives in the untamed wilderness. But for me, it would never be just a campfire story. a thrilling anecdote to share with other outdoor enthusiasts. It would forever be a source of unshakable, primal terror, a reminder that true horror exists outside the confines of fiction, lurking in the lonely, forgotten corners of our world. I still go hiking and camping, still seek out the peace and solitude of wild places. But I'm warier now, more cautious of the blank spots on the map and the paths less traveled, because I know that the woods aren't always empty, and sometimes the things you find out there are better left unexplained and undisturbed. That cage, that awful, nightmarish thing, still haunts my dreams and lurks in the darkest recesses of my mind. And as much as I try to rationalize it, to fit it into some logical framework, I know I'll never truly be free of the indelible mark it left on my psyche. The woods hold many secrets, some beautiful and awe-inspiring, others dark and terrible beyond imagining. And I know now, with grim finality, that there are some secrets that should never be uncovered, some mysteries that are best left alone to the mercy of the wilderness. That rusted metal cage, out there in the middle of nowhere, will likely remain an unsolved enigma. Its purpose, its creator, the unimaginable acts that may have occurred within its unforgiving confines, all lost to the impartial annals of nature and time. But for me, it will forever serve as a chilling reminder of the dark underbelly that lurks beneath the surface of our world, the potential for unspeakable horror that exists in the most innocuous of places. I often wonder about the person who built it, who spent weeks out there in the icy solitude doing God knows what. Were they simply a disturbed loner, grappling with their own twisted demons in the only way they knew how? Or were they something far more sinister, a predator using the remote wilderness as their own private hunting ground, leaving no trace of their dark deeds? I suppose I'll never know for sure, but what I do know is that the experience changed me on a fundamental level. It stripped away the veil of ignorant bliss, the comforting illusion that the most remote and untouched places are free from the stain of human darkness. I can never look at the wilderness the same way, never fully shake the insidious sense that something wicked could be lurking just beyond the flicker of the campfire, waiting for its chance to strike. But even so, I refuse to let it keep me from the wild places I love so dearly. I still seek out the tranquility and raw beauty of nature, still push myself to explore the untrammeled corners of the map. Only now, I do so with a keener awareness, a honed vigilance for the signs that something may be amiss. I share my story not to spread fear, but to impart a hard-learned lesson to my fellow outdoor enthusiasts, to remind them that while the woods can offer solace and adventure, they are not always the refuge we imagine them to be, that sometimes the most unassuming corners can hide the most unspeakable of evils. So to all those who seek out the untamed wild, I say this: tread carefully, keep your wits about you, and if you should stumble upon something that sets your very soul on edge, something that feels intrinsically, viscerally wrong, don't let your guard down. Trust that primal instinct, that ancient warning that has kept our species alive for millennia, for it's when we ignore those whispered cautions, when we venture foolishly into the domain of monsters, that we risk meeting a fate far worse than we could ever imagine. The woods keep their secrets for a reason, and some things are better left lost to their shadowy depths, never to see the light of day or the knowing eyes of civilization. As for me, I'll continue to chase the call of the wild, to seek out the untouched places and push the boundaries of my own resilience. But I'll do so with the hard-earned respect of one who has gazed into the abyss and come back forever changed. The scars on my psyche may never fully heal, but they serve as a constant reminder to never take the untamed world for granted, to never underestimate the depths of darkness that may lurk in its most remote corners, because in the end, we're all just visitors in the vast, uncaring wilderness. And it is a realm that predates us, that will persist long after we are gone, its secrets and horrors enduring for an eternity. All we can do is adapt, learn from our brushes with the unspeakable, and never forget that we are not always the masters of our fate when we step into the untamed wild. Twice each year, my wife and I venture into the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado in our RV. The rhythm of our travels usually follows the seasons. One journey in the warmth of summer, another when winter transforms the landscape into a pristine wonderland. My wife has always been drawn to the snow-covered peaks, finding peace in their stark beauty. These trips became our tradition over the past decade, each visit adding another layer to our connection with the mountains. But last year, nature decided to show us a different side of herself. The snow began innocently enough, but soon revealed its true intensity. For 4 relentless days, it fell without pause, building layer upon devastating layer. The first day seemed typical, gentle flakes drifting down, coating everything in white. By day 2, the accumulation became noticeable, and we had to regularly clear the RV's roof. The third day brought winds that whipped the snow into stinging clouds, forcing us to shelter inside. On the 4th day, the world outside became a blur of white, with visibility dropping to mere feet. By the 5th day, we witnessed nature's raw power as avalanches descended around us with frightening regularity. The landscape had already been scarred. The previous winter's massive slides had stripped entire hillsides bare of trees, while summer wildfires had scorched through our usual camping areas. We'd seen the damage during our summer visit, but hadn't fully grasped how it would affect winter conditions. The mountainsides that once stood strong and green now exposed bare rock and burned stumps, like wounds that hadn't yet healed. The barren slopes, now stripped of their natural anchors, couldn't hold the mounting snow. What was once solid ground transformed into unstable rivers of ice and snow, flowing with terrible force. We watched from our RV window as the first slide came down, a distant rumble growing into a thunderous roar. The snow moved like a living thing, consuming everything in its path. Our primary route to civilization was completely cut off, and while we had mapped out an alternative path, a much longer route through winding mountain roads, we could see the snow accumulating there as well. Inside our RV, we took stock of our supplies. The generator had enough fuel for several days, but our food stores were running low. We'd planned for a week-long trip, not an indefinite stay in a winter wasteland. The decision became clear. We needed to escape while we still had the chance. The weather report on our emergency radio warned of another storm system approaching, promising even heavier snowfall. Working against time and weather, we began dismantling our camp. The snow fell in intermittent bursts, forcing us to time our packing between the heaviest showers. Every movement required careful consideration. A slip could mean disaster, and the cold had become intense enough to make exposed skin ache within seconds. We developed a system. One person would prep items inside, while the other watched for signs of avalanche danger. Just as we loaded the final pieces of equipment, the mountain spoke again. The distinctive rumble of another avalanche echoed through the valley. By then, we'd grown accustomed to these sounds, but this one carried extra weight. Our escape route hung in the balance. With only 2 days of provisions remaining in the RV, the prospect of being trapped was becoming dangerously real. We'd heard stories of people stuck in the backcountry for weeks during severe weather, and we had no desire to join their ranks. We rushed to assess the damage, our boots crunching through fresh powder. The snow was nearly waist-deep in places, making each step a struggle. Initial relief washed over us when we saw our escape route remained clear. But that relief evaporated instantly when the scream pierced the air. It wasn't just any cry, it was primal, filled with pure terror and agony. The sound bounced off the mountain walls, amplifying its horror before cutting off with devastating suddenness. In that moment, we knew we'd witnessed someone's final seconds, their last desperate cry forever etched into the frozen landscape. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the soft hiss of falling snow and our own ragged breathing. We stood frozen, straining our ears for any follow-up sound, a call for help, movement, anything. But the mountains kept their secret. The vastness of the wilderness around us suddenly felt oppressive, as if the white peaks were closing in, watching with indifferent eyes. Time seemed to stop as we stood there, our breath visible in the frigid air, listening to the haunting silence that followed. The weight of responsibility pressed down on us, harder than the snow. We had to act, but the mountain's vastness made it impossible to pinpoint the scream's origin. Sound plays tricks in the snow, bouncing off ice and rock, making near seem far and far seem near. We debated our options, knowing that every minute that passed reduced any chance of finding someone alive. Despite the danger, we ventured out into the deepening snow, searching for anyone who might help. The cold bit through our layers of winter gear, and the wind had picked up again, driving ice crystals into any exposed skin. We moved carefully, conscious that the very ground beneath our feet could give way at any moment. Fortune smiled on us when we encountered a nearby adventurer with an ATV equipped with a radio. They immediately called for emergency services, but that's where our involvement had to end. The increasing avalanche risk made further searching too dangerous for untrained volunteers. The rescue coordinator's voice crackled over the radio, advising everyone in the area to evacuate immediately. They explained that conditions were deteriorating rapidly and more storms were approaching. Professional search and rescue teams were being mobilized, but they needed the area clear of civilians to work effectively. With heavy hearts, we made our way back to our RV. Once professional help was mobilized, we made the difficult decision to leave. The drive home along I-70 revealed the storm's true scope. The usually familiar Glenwood Canyon had become an alien landscape. The road wound through towering walls of rock and ice, with massive icicles hanging like nature's sword of Damocles above us. We later learned that barely 45 minutes after we passed through, a massive avalanche tore through the area with unprecedented force. The power of this slide was beyond comprehension. It actually altered the Colorado River's course, as if nature herself was redrawing the map. Entire sections of the highway vanished beneath tons of snow and debris, erased as easily as pencil marks from paper. Concrete barriers designed to withstand tremendous forces were snapped like twigs. The destruction transformed familiar landmarks into unrecognizable masses of white and gray, creating an apocalyptic scene that seemed more fitting for a disaster film than our regular camping route. We watched the news reports for days afterward, hoping to learn what had happened to the person behind that scream. But if any bodies were recovered, the information was never made public. Perhaps the mountains chose to keep that secret, adding it to their centuries of untold stories. The uncertainty haunted us more than confirmation would have. Imagination filled in the blanks with countless scenarios, each more terrible than the last. Looking back, that trip served as a humbling reminder of humanity's place in the natural world. The mountains, which had always provided us with solace and adventure, revealed their indifferent power. They showed us how quickly comfort can turn to danger, how thin the line is between enjoyment and survival. We learned that the wilderness doesn't care about human plans or preparations. It operates on its own ancient rhythms, unchanging and unforgiving. Spring has returned to the San Juans now, and most traces of that terrible winter have melted away. The scorched earth is beginning to show signs of new growth, and the avalanche paths are slowly being reclaimed by vegetation. But the memory remains vivid, especially that scream. It surfaces in quiet moments, carrying with it the weight of nature's awesome force. The experience fundamentally changed our relationship with the mountains. We still return, drawn by their majesty, but now we carry a deeper understanding of their dual nature. Beautiful, yet potentially lethal. Inviting, yet ultimately wild. Each trip now begins with meticulous preparation, extra supplies, and carefully studied weather reports. We've learned to read the snow with new eyes, to listen more carefully to the mountain's warnings. We've installed additional safety equipment in our RV and taken advanced winter survival courses. That winter taught us that respect for nature isn't just about appreciation. It's about understanding our own limitations in the face of something far greater than ourselves. The mountains remain our sanctuary, but now we approach them with the caution and reverence they deserve. We've learned to watch for subtle signs of danger, the way snow crystals form, the changing patterns of wind on the peaks, the different types of silence that can signal either peace or imminent danger. Our love for the wilderness hasn't diminished, but it's matured into something more complex, more aware. Sometimes on clear winter nights in the mountains, when the stars shine with impossible brightness and the snow reflects their light, we remember that day. The memory serves not to frighten us, but to remind us of our place in this vast landscape. The mountains stand as they have for millions of years, indifferent to our presence, neither malevolent nor benevolent, simply there in all their magnificent, dangerous beauty. And we continue to visit them, now wiser, more prepared, and infinitely more respectful of their power.